weariness. Now, Donnie, you
Yeah.
can fill us in on world weariness.
Well, I would hardly call it a nice.
No, I've been following you very, very slowly as you plod through this. I'm waiting for something to percolate here. So, what, David, are you the one who is experiencing world weariness?
He's experiencing fire,
Okay. All right.
which is, certainly a burden.
Okay, that's your thought of the
Okay.
week,
Got
world
it.
weariness. Think about that for the rest of
Okay.
the week.
So what I'm posting right now is the text from last week, but not because we're going to go back through it. I'm posting it for reference as we go into the next paragraph, because as we're here, let's see. We talked through all of this.
What's the beginning of the paragraph so I could find it?
That's the paragraph that starts the Romans, both
Oh,
plebes
okay.
and commoners.
Okay. The Romans, both pleb, plebe and commoners. Okay, got it.
Of course, we say plebes, but you're right. The Romans themselves said plebs.
Plebs. Okay.
That's the Latin.
Well, in any self-respecting society, there is the leadership and there are the children. And the children being the common man.
Rick, is that chapter 5 of the medieval civilization?
So medieval civilization starts in chapter 5. Chapter 4 is ancient civilization, and chapters 1, 2, and 3 are introductory. So chapter 5 of the book is the first chapter of the medieval civilization
Okay.
section.
So we're in that chapter 5 then? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I put the link.
Thank you.
I'll put the link again. There we go.
So remember that one of those Alfred the Great films when he's training to be a priest, and his brother is dying, and brother after brother has died, and Alfred the Great is actually down the bottom, so they're going to make him a priest, but it was time for him to be king again. They had to drag him out of the monastery and convince him to be worldly again, and he kept on calling them worldly filth.
Yes. Yes. And he spent the entire rest of his career unable to resist erotic temptation and having sex with, the maids, the women who worked in the dairy, random women walking by. It was his, both he and his confessor said that it was his major problem as he was just, once they got him out of the monastery, he just couldn't stop flirting and having sex with people. It was a great shame to him. He's like, I'm a ruined priest. Yeah, that's the period. Alfred the Great and his daughter and son. That's the period that I used to do my Dungeons and Dragons campaign in. So I have an entire bookcase full of books on that period of history. It's really interesting.
Dungeons and Dragons in uh, when was that? That was the eighth, ninth, ninth century, was it?
Well, Dungeons and Dragons is completely made up fantasy, so it's whenever you want to put it. But I did a highly edited version of it that was set historically around. It was set in the year 1000, 1001, 1002. So the things that happened, a century before that with Alfred the Great and then with his kids, a huge influence on what was happening around the year 1000.
Yeah.
Well, this
Was there
this
expectation the world was coming to an end at 1,000? It seems like a nice round number.
No, they didn't factor the years that way. We
Yeah,
sort of
but
retroactively have inserted, the timing of the years. They used to do, what was, the fourth year of reign so and so, of King so and so, fourth year
uh,
of the reign of King so and so, and they didn't really keep track of the big numbers. Hardly anyone knew what year it
uh,
was in
plus
Britain.
they didn't have Y2K, so
Yeah, they didn't have Y1K, but there are other places where people had panics around the year 1000 for sure. It just not so much in Britain. They what they were panicking about in Britain was the Vikings, who continued to be a problem right up until they conquered England, having detoured through France.
Well, it's 300 years worth, actually, if you count it all up.
Yeah, the late 700s were the first attack on the British Isles at Lindisfarne. They took out Lindisfarne. And then the 800s
Up
went
into
very-
Harold Hardrada's time.
Yes. The 800s went very badly for the Saxon and English kingdoms, all the way to the point where England was pretty much a handful of people in a swamp with Alfred the Great. That was the nadir in the late 800s.
Yeah, that was my line, I thought. The Kingdom of England was a few meters of Somerset swamp.
Yeah, I'm totally quoting you. But it's true. I mean, you're absolutely right on. That's how things were. And then they slowly started reconquering the British Isles, and it was Alfred's daughter and son who finished it. They put together the maps of everywhere that the Vikings had used to cross from one place to another, and they picked all the spots there, and they built burgs. They built, walled towns at each of those spots. And so the Vikings would come back where they'd come before with no problem, and all of a sudden they're fighting a battle to try to get even to try to get in. And by the time they were done, it was around 917. The largest of the Danish armies just surrendered. They said, this is too hard. Let's just live here. Let's all be English people together. But that didn't stop additional outside people from coming in and harassing things for a while.
Yeah, it seems some of them broke away from English rule. I think the boroughs for a while,
Yeah,
and the Yorkshire region broke away. They never really properly integrated it into England until I think the 950s,
yes.
and even then they had a problem.
Yeah, they kept having sporadic problems after that, but it was never as bad as it had been during the 800s when it looked like England was going to be erased. It just wasn't going to be one. So anyway, all of that's at some point we'll do a deeper dive on that stuff. The history of Christianity and Vikings in England is very interesting, but I'm going to take us back to the text. I'm going to take us to where Stephen had us, which is the opening of what under David's numbering, which I'm going to adopt from here on out, is paragraph 10. So let's start into that.
Okay, just reminding you all that we had man is wolf to man as the last bit of the previous paragraph.
Yes.
Hold that thought.
It's really important to hang on to. He's right. Stephen's absolutely right. Everything that happens in paragraph 10 is running off of homo lupus homines. So paragraph 10, sentences 1 and 2. Christianity, of course, taught contempt for such materialism and for all the other vanities of this world. No other world religion has made, quote, worldliness into such an opprobrium as a vice of compromise and conformism that in extremis makes one indeed a deluded slave of the shrewd arrangements of self-interest.
Okay, that last bit I'm struggling with.
Yes. So, worldliness was considered a virtue before in the ancient world order. In the ancient world order, paying attention to nature was the most sacred thing. The gods were merely expressions of important aspects of nature. The daimones were merely, aspects of nature. Nature was as sacred as it got. But Christianity inverted that value system and made the world and nature into, first of all, meaninglessness. It was created by God according to his whim, could have been made any possible way. God just chose to make it this way, but it could have been different. So therefore, you can't study the world to figure out how things have to be, because things don't have to be this way. This is just how God made them at the moment. Maybe he'll change his mind tomorrow. You don't know, right? So the importance of studying the world has gone out the window. And furthermore, they link what the patristic fathers do is they link that value system based on the world to everything that went wrong in the Roman Empire. And they say, that's why you suck. The reason you guys suck is because, you claim to be worshiping gods, but the things that you're worshiping are just statues. They're not really gods, or they're just men who are emperors who are claiming to be gods. None of that's sacred. We will tell you what's sacred. It's our concept of God, this Christian concept of God. This is what's sacred. say the patristic fathers, and everything else is worldliness. And therefore, everything that ever went wrong anywhere that didn't involve worshiping our God, all those problems are now laid at the feet of nature. It's all nature's fault. It's all the fault of worldliness. So they have managed to scapegoat what the ancients considered to be the very most important thing in the world and say it is guilty of everything that ever went wrong. It's worldliness. So they didn't just take the importance away from nature, but they basically ascribed all the sins to nature and to worldliness. Nobody's ever done that at that level of extremism before that the proto-medieval Christians did. And
Manichaeans?
the Manichaeans, well, they said it's not the world per se, right? It's the force of evil. There's the force of good and the force of evil. And so they had this external force of evil. Whereas to the medieval Christians, when some splinter groups tried to set up the devil as a Manichaean force of evil in opposition to God, the force of good, they were struck down as heretics, because that suggests that God is not all powerful. And in the medieval framework, God has to be all powerful. That means there can't be an evil rival to God who's on a par with him. And so they declared Manichaeanism and anything like it to be heresy. That's not legitimate Orthodox Christianity.
I was sorry for interrupting, but I was checking the era. And as that progress occurred from when Christianity was made legal, in so many decades it became top dog.
Yes.
Manichaeans were almost the top of the list when they started persecuting. They only beat the sorcerers. First, it was the sorcerers that were being persecuted, and that was always universal with the Romans.
Right.
But the very first heresy that was on the list were the Manichaeans.
Yes. And it's interesting, this concept that the world is not dual, but is unitary, that there's only one source of meaning, and it's the Christian God, and that everything else is a heresy or a distraction away from that kind of central monolithic focus. It's interesting that would be the initial core argument, because if you look at the varieties of Christianity that emerge over the next let's say the next 1,500 years, right? Let's go all the way from Jesus's time through, 1,500 or so. And, if you look at what are the different splinter groups in Christianity, you see that some variation on Manichaeism is the most common. I mean, look, people are constantly shifting their focus from God and Jesus to the devil. The devil, save us from the devil. The devil's doing all these things. Don't fall to the devil. There are a number of churches that, want to talk about the devil a lot more than they want to talk about God. And when they want to talk about God, it's that God will save us from the devil. That's essentially the argument of The Exorcist. If you watch the movie The Exorcist, it's that, if it's not for Jesus and God, the devil's going to get us all. You can't even play with a Ouija board without the devil getting in and corrupting your children and doing terrible things. And so, thank God he's there to save us from the force of evil. Well, that whole concept in The Exorcist is Manichaeism, just with, a Catholic dress on top of it. And it's basically a heresy. Augustine would have identified the theology of the film The Exorcist as heresy. And it keeps cropping up. And it keeps cropping up partially because it's so useful. Right? I mean, if you want to scare people, you need a boogeyman, and the devil's really good for that. And the fact that the core medieval Orthodox argument about Christianity said, no, the devil can't be your boogeyman. He's just not that important. God's what's important. That wasn't satisfying to a large number of theologians and everyday people. And so they kept propping the devil back up as some kind of counterforce. Part of what's interesting about that is that there's very slim pickings in the Bible for justifying Manichaeism. I mean, the name Lucifer appears exactly once. And when it appears, it's clearly referring to the planet Venus, the morning star, not to, the devil. Things like Satan, the devil, and so on, these appear very little. Outside of Revelation, they appear very little. So this kind of reintroduction over and over of a Manichaean devil to represent the evils of worldliness but also the idea that the devil made this world and he made it, bad, and this is a vale of tears, and all of that stuff, which you can hear all the time, even in modern preaching by televangelists. It's all absolutely heresy according to the core medieval orthodoxy. But that doesn't stop it from coming back up. Ari, I've been going on for a while. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey guys, I actually am going to do something a little different. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. They're slightly expansive, but they're mostly just simple questions. Number one is, would we say this worldliness that we're referring to here as the sort of the cause of evil or the failure of man? I feel like I've studied this from, and again, as an outsider, I'm really from a Jewish perspective. It's looking at things differently. So I'm trying to imagine the Christian perspective here, or maybe the early Christian perspective, if we want to talk about it, of the medieval. Are we talking about this worldliness? Was this when the idea of original sin was thought of this as this worldliness? Is this the original sin is the sort of indulgence of the natural world, or getting caught up in the natural world? And then does that mean that this the devil, which is interesting because in Judaism there is something called the Satan, and it's really it's the prosecuting attorney that's going to be making a case for against you when you go before the throne of glory. He's still just an angel of God, but the Satan in the Christian understanding, I always thought that as like the snake with the original sin. Is this also correct? I don't know if there's a relationship there. And then the next question, which is the real thing I want someone to actually talk about, perhaps you, Rick, is I'm very new, or almost like I'm impressed to say that I'm rather ignorant about Manichaeism. I have almost never really heard this word before. I'm embarrassed to say, and I'd like to do like I'm a kindergartner, coming to a new subject to talk about Manichaeism. And the specific caveat here is I thought the good and evil aspect of monotheism came from Zoroastrianism. And this idea of this is where thus spoke Zarathustra, because Zarathustra is the famous priest of Zoroastrianism, and there's this good of evil. Well, I thought Satan in the Christian world reflects the evil aspects of things. And so this is where, how did this all get mixed up in the same bag? Or maybe I'm wrong and it's not actually mixed up in the same bag. Clearly there's a lot of holes in my knowledge here, and I'd really like someone to talk about Manichaeism as where it comes in. Where does it first enter the story? Where does it first enter the story? How does it get wrapped up and become this devil that you're describing? How does that happen? That's really novel. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say.
Those are great questions. So, Manichaeism was an attempt to unify Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Marcionism, early Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism. It was an attempt. So let me take a step back. We talk about the ancient world as having phases, not just the rising, the flourishing, and the falling, but there's the Hellenic phase. And then it's followed by sort of the Alexandrian or Hellenistic phase, where they've wielded the Greeks together, but they're now being run by the Macedonians and are making a big empire. And then there's the Roman phase that comes after that. So part of what's interesting about the Hellenistic phase, Kenneth talks about this less in this book than he does elsewhere, is his critique of the Alexandrian era is that it's a period of academicism when people are doing a lot less innovative thinking. You're not finding any more Heraclitus or Thales or anybody at that level, but you're getting a lot more kind of hands-on practical stuff, and you're getting a lot more sort of what we might call encyclopedism, the idea of let's copy all the books, let's build big libraries, let's compare different belief systems. And it's from the Hellenistic period that you see all of these sort of attempts to unify Greek gods with Egyptian gods, and you start getting, names that are like Thoth dash this or Mercury dash so-and-so. There's a blending and merging that's going on. And Manichaeism, that continues into the Roman period. The Romans use that as state imperial policy. They start saying, well, our Jupiter is the same as your Zeus, and our Bacchus is the same as your Dionysus, our Minerva is the same as your Athena, even though they're not. They're actually significantly different in character prior to these supposed mergers. They sort of invent this Greco-Roman idea as a tool of empire. So by the time the Manichaeism is launching, what's happening, they're already in a world where for centuries it has been the norm to try to do this blending syncretism, to create new kind of religions by combining old ones. And so Mani, basically, he really tries to put them all together, everything he's ever heard of, into one big super religion. And so when you say that you thought it came from Zoroastrianism, you're not wrong. But the road that it got to Christianity from is through Manichaeism. Mani was the first one to bring Zoroaster Christianity together. And of course,
do you know approximately when this Mani person, sorry to be hopefully not disrespectful to whoever he is, I feel like I've never heard his name before. When did he exist? When did this start happening?
So, this is in the 200s of the current era. So there's a link to Mani. So a couple centuries after Jesus, and a couple centuries before the Roman Empire comes apart. So it's right in the middle of the Roman imperial period. He's Persian. He's basically someone who is on the crossroads, where he's able to, hear teachings not only from the West but from the East. He's looking at Buddhism and other religions from further into Asia too, and he's basically trying to syncretize them all together into his super religion. And it was very popular for a while, and part of the reason that it was popular is that, by the 200s, the Roman Empire and the various civilizations around it are really struggling with the fact that it's clear that Rome isn't going to deliver on its promises either. It's Rome was supposed to solve the problems from earlier in the ancient world, the Pax Romana, that we'd all be united around one idea with one capital and one sort of polytheistic religion that includes all other religions. It was supposed to be a harmonizing influence, but the corruption by the 200, it was already clear in the first century, but by the 200s, we have just seen so many terrible emperors and so much corruption in the turnover that people have lost their faith that it's going to solve all the problems. And they're ripe for someone to come along and say, the problem of evil really needs to be explained. It needs to be grappled with in a clear, coherent way. Why do so many things go so badly? And so the idea that the reason is that there's this devil, there is a force of evil. It's one dude. Let's scapegoat this one powerful dude. He's at fault. And you join the good team. The good team needs to defeat the evil team. You still see this in every presidential speech ever in the United States. Every time they talk foreign policy, America is on the side of good, and we have to fight against the side of evil. It's all Manichaeism, right? Not a bit of it is authentic Christianity. It's all this struggle between good and evil. During the Gulf War, under the Bush presidency, talked about the axis of evil. Well, the axis of evil, that's Manichaeism, just expressed in a foreign policy way instead of in a theological way. And he expresses it this way because Manichaeism is so central to the American versions of Christianity. The president knows that if he wants to win over the electorate and get them behind him, he has to express every major foreign policy initiative as a great struggle between good and evil, in which America is the exceptional good country fighting for good, and we have to go beat the bad guys. So all of this, it's
not forgetting America's religious roots.
Yes, exactly. So this is what's so interesting about this, is that these are very old roots. They've been going on for 1800 years in Europe at least, and of course if you trace it back to Zoroastrianism, far before that, right? This notion of the two great forces of good and evil. So, but what the Orthodox, the Catholic emerging medieval Christianity is saying around the same time Mani is talking, they're saying that's absolutely not right. They're saying, if you say that, you're not a monotheist anymore. You're a ditheist or bitheist. You think there's two gods, a good God and an evil God. And what the emerging consensus in the theology of what's going to become medieval Christianity is that is capitulating to polytheism. They're taking the hardest possible stand against polytheism that they can by saying there's only one God. They're saying that there has to be only one God, and therefore the devil can't be a serious competitor to God. You just can't do that, or else you've become a polytheist. They don't want it. So there's a struggle happening in the 200s. Mani says these things. They spread west and east out of Persia. They take the Roman Empire by storm, and just like a century before, the emerging orthodoxy had fought a long theological struggle with the Gnostics to try to get rid of this Gnostic quote unquote heresy from their perspective. They now are going to spend the 200s and early 300s struggling, and frankly, all the way to this day, trying to get rid of this new, Manichaean heresy and try to get back to the idea of the one true God. And their way of doing it is to say the forces of evil aren't another alternative God. It's not the devil that's the problem. The problem is that all these polytheistic religions didn't actually worship gods. They worshiped worldliness. They worshiped lust. They made a point out of all the fertility religions and said it's not about fertility, it's about lust, and lust is a sin. It's about, they're going after pride. They're going after all these things and saying these are the things of the body, right? These are the things of this world, the soil. And that's what makes them wrong, because they're turning you away from your focus on God. And so this is the emerging conception of the theology and the problem of evil that's coming out of these struggles. And so that's what Kenneth's talking about here. He says worldliness becomes the core opprobrium of the central tenets of the emerging medievalism, because they're trying to avoid propping up a second God as the bad guy. They're saying that's not the problem. The problem is turning away from the one true God. When you turn towards the world and away from God, then sin arises. You miss the mark, hamartia in Greek. So I don't know if that helps, Ari, but that's kind of my little capsule intro to the relationship between the worldliness fears of.
Thank you very much. That was super helpful. It does beg the big question, which is probably the next 100 weeks that we're going to talk about it, is why Christianity and why not Manichaeism? Why did Christianity win and become everything, and why is Manichaeism something I barely even know about, right?
Yes.
So,
yes, we will be spending the next 2 years talking about that. And we'll keep talking about it into the modern era, because Manichaeism has become such a major part of modernist forms of Christianity. There are versions of Christianity that are absolutely clear that they are not Manichaeist, but the average rank and file Christian in the United States is a Manichaean, whether they know it or not, whether they understand the origins of their obsessions with the devil or not. That's where it's coming from. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what you said about Manichaeism is very helpful, but it's still very vague to me. I mean, like, if it sort of started with Zoroastrianism out of Persia, when did that occur, and to what degree that affected Plato's ideas through Plotinus, and how did Augustine deal with that relationship? Because it seems to me Augustine came into real power at about 300 AD. So it seems like it's right at that time that he would have been familiar with that in some way. And so was he purifying what Plotinus has already embedded in this, or so in order to get back presumably to Plato, or how does that work? I mean, that seems like a very, very important relationship. Was he absorbing Plotinus and Manichaeism and then somehow purifying it, or was it just it wasn't quite as prominent as all that, so it skipped over that, because that seems like a very, very important turnaround in a funny way. So
yes. And we will keep talking about this over the next 2 years. There isn't going to be a short answer to this, but let me give you the high level sketch just to prepare us. There have been a lot of attempts in the modern era to sum up medieval Christian orthodoxy in some simple way, like Platonism for the masses. You've heard that one, right? And there's lots of these little bumper sticker recipe attempts to summarize it. But if you actually get into it in detail, what you discover is none of those bumper stickers works. That what's happening with the rise of medieval Christian, theology is a very complicated process of responding to what, from their perspective, is heresy after heresy after heresy. And each heresy is incredibly popular. It's got some feature that is deeply appealing and that people really want to follow. And each of these things causes a crisis for the emerging medieval theology, because their whole thing is to be the Catholic religion, the religion for everybody, right? The religious genocide is at the core of the medieval conception, to eliminate all of the religions. And having other religions take off and become popular, especially when the emerging church is young and isn't a giant military power in the world, right? I mean, they have the power of their persuasion, and that's about it for the first few centuries. They don't have, it's not like Charlemagne, it's not like they've got the Holy Roman Emperor out there running around, raising sacred groves and murdering pagans in order to eliminate alternatives. This is 500 years before that. They don't have that level of power. The only way that they have to try to get rid of these other religions is through persuasion. And that means they really have to grapple with the theology of what are the differences between what they're saying and what we're saying. Why do those differences exist? And how can you make turning away from those very popular ideas something that itself becomes popular? The result is a very tricky theology. It's very carefully constructed over time.
This helped clarify to a certain degree, my conversation I had when I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I had a roommate who was a philosophy major at Marquette, and we were pretty good friends. And he seemed to be a good friend of this theologian, who, by the way, is Lutheran. And they invited me to dinner, so we got a pretty friendly discussion going. And so I decided to pop a very important question to the theologian. Because it's kind of interesting. He's Lutheran. I asked him, what sort of God is your God that allow a mere mortal, I didn't say Plato, a mere mortal to take over his church? And he actually gave a good answer, but I wish he had explained it in more detail, like you said. He says, it's not a matter of something wrong with my God, but the people demanded it. And so we had to give it to them. And so that's a very simple gloss over that explanation that you're giving now. There's much more detail how it evolved. But the people had something to do with it. If the people were embedded in this Manichaeanism, and so they demanded it, we had to give it to them. Otherwise, like they're going to close the church. So that's interesting. So yeah, I wish I knew that, because like he sort of got away with that simplified answer, you know. I thought it was more like, well, kind of more like people demanded to not have church service at Sunday morning football games. So that was a very simple answer, but this is much more complex. So thank you.
Yeah, so this is why we're gonna take our time with this, is that by the end of this 2-year period, I'm hoping that we walk away with an enormous amount. This might not sound appealing at first, but trust me, it's a lot more interesting than it sounds. But we're going to walk away with a lot of complex theology in our heads. We will have gone through each of these major struggles. And the reason that we have to go through them one at a time is trying to do them all at once is overwhelming. You just can't do it. And each of these struggles around some major piece of their theology was a massive period in the history of the medieval period. That was like what the big deal was, that led up to Augustine writing City of God. This is not something unimportant to understanding the epoch. For when you have the word monomania isn't the right word. It's not the word I'm looking for. But when you have sort of a monotheist, monomaniac, a central, there can be only one obsession as your core unifying principle, which they took running from Rome as being the one polis for everybody, right? It's again a monomania, but they move it into a religious realm. When you have that as the core organizing principle of an entire epoch, you can't afford to be ignorant about what that core work is, because if you are, you won't understand anything those people do. They're obsessed with that issue and what those core issues are, and they make their decisions based on them. The hypocrisy that we see by the 1400s and 1500s, the really terrible, people just clearly not believing in it, this is a late development in the medieval epoch. Most of the medieval epoch is defined by the contrary, by people who deeply believe and are trying to make this work. They're trying to create a world religion, deliberately sculpted to be one. So I think it's not a coincidence, for example, this is something I started thinking in the last year or two. Most people don't know that there's a lot of Catholic involvement in programming language standards committees. Lots of and maybe not just programming language standards, but maybe other kinds of standards as well. Standardization. How do you make a core document that people can unite around, and they can vary from, but that they share this kind of core central lingua franca area that allows us to communicate?
But the way you express it, it seems like the church fathers, who they might be, actually didn't believe Augustine's argument. They were building a church. They were constructing a synthetic structure. So they actually didn't believe in the deep relationship that Augustine had, because, like I said, they had to give up because the people are going to leave. We got to make the argument right so that they would stay. So they were building a a structure that's manifested in the world, rather than, let's say, well, Augustine's got it right. Doesn't matter if we live very poorly and we're gonna go to heaven, the city of God, whatever. So they kind of didn't believe that. Otherwise, they would say, well, what the hell? Let them leave. You know what I mean?
I think what
We
you're
are
going to
with
find
God.
is that it's a dialectic between the two, first of all.
Yeah.
That the church fathers themselves were torn on these issues. They pulled back and forth. To what extent are we willing to compromise in order to hold the church together on the one hand? But on the other hand, to what extent do we genuinely believe this and we're not willing to compromise? And it's what makes the history so interesting, is that it's not as simple as either or. The other major part of this is that same dialectic happens differently in different church fathers. Now, they each have a different take. They're not of one mind, but this is not the Borg at all, which is what makes it so interesting that they're trying to do this Catholic world religion when they themselves don't entirely agree. Some of them are writing centuries apart from each other, and the theology is developing over time as it goes. And if you could have time traveled them into the same room and sat them around a conference table, on some things there would have been a lot of brotherhood and fellowship and warm feelings, and others there would have been hot feelings, and they would have been yelling at each other because the theology changed in ways that people couldn't have anticipated or didn't remember later. So it's part of what makes this so interesting, is that it's going to develop in stages as we go. And remember, part of what's so fascinating about the medieval epoch is that we have the whole story. I mean, we don't have the parts that have dropped out of the historical record. We don't have that for any epoch. But of the things that stay in the historical record, we've got the whole thing for the medieval epoch, beginning, middle, and end. We don't have that for the ancient epoch because we don't have the beginning, and we don't have that for the modern epoch because we don't have the end. So it's worth putting extra time into studying the medieval epoch, because it's going to teach us things about how an epoch arises, not just how it flourishes. And as well, it's going to teach us about how it falls apart at the end, that we can't learn from the other two, right? I mean, we see the end of the ancient epoch, but we don't fully understand what's happening because we never saw the beginning. It's like coming in halfway through a movie and trying to work out what happened. You hope it wasn't a time travel movie like Time After Time, and they're all in San Francisco in the modern day, and you're going, wait a minute, didn't they start out in Victorian England? What the hell happened? It's like, what happens at the end of the movie Time After Time makes an enormous difference if you know the beginning. If you're missing that, you really can't interpret properly what's going on. This is how we are with the ancients. We don't entirely understand what happened in the end.
Well, you're saying something. You're saying something that occurred to me that's kind of interesting. It almost seems like that's a setting of literature altogether. I mean, like the plot, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
the middle, when the turn happens, is the decisive moment at the beginning. So almost seems like it relates to the narrative structure of
yes,
storytelling, whether it goes this way or
yes,
that way. It's the basic plot. I guess it could go this way, which is like
yes.
melodrama, but but nonetheless, that's interesting because it almost seems like storytelling is in
That's
some sense
exactly right.
embedded in that relationship. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And and that's the way to think about it, right? The purpose of the opening of the book is to establish the setting and what's at stake and what the promise is. And it gives us our interpretive framework for understanding everything that happens after that. If we're missing the beginning, we don't actually get a story, we just get a plot because we don't know what's at stake and we don't know, what the promise was. We don't know anything. We're just sort of following along like a roller coaster. And that's what it's like to look at the ancient epoch where we're missing the origins. Where what was the setting. So that's why we're going to take part of why we're going to take our time going through this one peeling one layer of theology at a time through the medieval epoch is because this is where we're going to learn what's at stake and what the story is. That explains why a Joan of Arc could arise during the medieval period, and she could not have arisen during the ancient or modern periods. It just couldn't have happened. The entire framework for interpreting the world is so radically alien in the ancient and modern worlds that although you can get imitators who wish that they were Joan of Arc, you can't get somebody who genuinely could pull off what she did and seriously threaten the powers that be merely through her attachment to God. I mean, we see wannabe Joan of Arc's, on street corners preaching, all over America, but not one of them right creates this giant following that kicks out all the corruption in DC. And it's like the way that Iceland could just decide that the bankers were corrupt and stick them all in jail. That could never happen in America. It's like the story of Iceland is so different from the story of America. The one group that will never go into jail here is the bankers. They can do anything that they want and they're not going to go to jail. But in Iceland, they could just vote and say, you know what, those guys are corrupt. Let's put them in jail. So it's like that level of difference is what's going on when we look at today's wannabe Joan of Arcs and compare them to what actually happened with Joan of Arc in the medieval period. Is she's working within a worldview that she belongs in, she's native to, and that world is electrified by her. And in the modern world, we're so used to corruption, and no, there isn't. Even the religious people have their attitude towards religion is totally different from the medieval attitudes towards religion. That none of these people who want to be Joan of Arc again can get the kind of purchase that's required to do it. It's interesting, but the story hangs over us, right? Which is why the FBI was so terrified of Martin Luther King Jr. and other people like him. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, Time After Time, which was it an old movie or a more recent movie? Or
I'll put a link. It was from the 1980s. And I remember when
that's something sort of based on the time machine idea.
1979, it stars one of the lead characters is playing H.G. Wells himself, who supposedly
Yeah, I remember the story.
actually
Jack the
made the time
Ripper
machine.
escapes
Yes.
into the
Escapes into the future.
around 1980 and suddenly discovers he's perfectly at home, and he says,
Perfectly at home in the modern world.
George, you're the freak here. You
That's
go
what
back.
he says.
This world is perfect for me. Yes.
Yeah. Anyone who doesn't fully get the idea of epochs, watching time after time is an entertaining way to do it because it is a central issue. As Stephen's saying, it's a central issue of the story that Jack the Ripper recognizes how different modern San Francisco is from Victorian London, and he revels in the differences, whereas H.G. Wells's character is struggling with the differences. You're getting to see the conflict of worldviews at work.
Okay. Anyway, I was just going to ask about that last line again. There's a
Yes.
vice of compromise and conformism that in extremis makes one indeed a deluded slave of the shrewd arrangements of self-interest.
We're going to spend all day today picking this apart. You've put your finger on
Okay,
it.
so he's not a big fan of self-interest at this point. I was just looking up Max Stirner recently.
Well, let's say self-interest can take different forms, right? It all depends on what you think your interest is. So the self-interest of an Aristotle is very different from the self-interest of a Nero or a Tiberius. And it's part of why he feels so differently about the Greeks than he does about the Romans. So this is what I want to make all of today's session about. Is this you've really picked it out here. I did a whole bunch of prep work and you just zeroed right in on the core phrase. This clause is the killer. It's because like you're pointing out, Stephen, it's dense. Suddenly this language, the first sentence and the first half of the second sentence are easy enough. And then in this second half of the second sentence, it suddenly is a throwback to chapter 4, where it's full of intense terminology. And a frame. So I'm gonna pull this apart. There's some places in paragraph, what we're calling paragraph 10 now, where he suddenly goes very dense, and it's easy to breeze past and miss it. And I did the first time I read it, back 25 years ago. But now that I'm going through it, some things are jumping out at me as being really important to Kenneth, but that maybe he didn't spend enough time on for us to recognize how important those issues are for him. So thanks for that, Stephen. We're gonna.
Well, it's a slight discussion of self-interest. I was looking up Max Stirner. You are familiar with the name, I assume.
Yeah.
Well, I think when he wrote The Ego on Its Own, which people say could mean the unique individual, he was a strong believer in the unique individual. And I was looking at what he said, and I don't think he was engaging in ego worship. If he was flying that flag, it was just to annoy a few of the other young Hegelians.
Uh-huh.
Because clearly he was reacting against the absolutism. Like, okay, you guys are worshipping man. Oh, that's right. It was God. You've crossed out God and put man in its place. Hey, blow you. I'm crossing out man and putting the individual in place. I'm making the individual my God, me.
Right.
But it doesn't sound like that was absolute. I think he was playing a game because he was clearly against the absolute idealism that was being involved here. He didn't seem to believe in any particular sort of absolutism. He only seemed to have adopted the position that at the end of the day, all our motives are self-interest. Seems to have been his point. Not that he was worshipping self-interest necessarily, but he was saying, this is a little creature at the back of our minds, which is actually, it's the puppet master is self-interest.
Yeah, it's highly relevant to this discussion. This is a part of that we've talked before, that in saying that the Aristotelian critique of Homo sapiens, which is lost in all the translations, is that we're the only species that doesn't know what its self-interest is. The cheetah knows what it should be interested in. Its interest shifts depending on its mood and whether it's just eaten or whether it's taken a bath, but it's always pointing at something that's essential for the species, or a choice of several things, any of which would be really good for the cheetah to do. And when the cheetah pursues that self-interest, sophrosune, that kind of self-interest, it improves the health of the individual cheetah, but it also improves the health of the cheetah's family, the cheetah species, the ecosystem of the savanna, and really all of life on Earth improves because it has evolved to the point where it's got sophrosune. And so self-interest in a creature that has sophrosune is wisdom. It's indistinguishable from what Aristotle and maybe Plato and others are calling, wisdom. But the problem is when you have an animal like Homo sapiens that has no sophrosyne, we don't know what the hell our self-interest is. And then self-interest devolves into egotism. It's like, well, I've decided that I need to be the king of Seattle. So, I'm going to set about becoming king of Seattle. Now, it might be absolutely against my self-interest. It might be much better for me to have somebody wiser than me be the king of Seattle, or to have no king of Seattle at all. And maybe I should be focusing on my back garden, because that will bring me joy and health in a way that pursuing becoming king of Seattle never could. I might have a short, I might be assassinated if I try to become king of Seattle.
Well, there's the two types of egoism in this case.
Yes.
There's the egoism which wants to perceive itself in terms of grandiosity.
Yes.
And now we're getting to the other type of egoism, which is the egoism of this, the Indian guru, the sannyasi or something like that, who rejects the world. So somebody who rejects the worldly says,
Right.
I'm just going to go and concentrate on my own salvation, my own feelings, my own well-being. I don't need to prove anything to anybody,
Right.
which is the other type of egoism.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, and what's fascinating is that when self-interest takes the form of sophrosyne, the result is both the greatest possible egotism and yet also at the same time somehow no egotism at all. It's like you couldn't ask the cheetah to give account of itself and tell you if it thinks it's important. It's so wholly coincides with the things that it wants and pursues that it can't separate itself enough to comment on them or critique them. And so it doesn't have the capacity to say, wow, I am just the greatest cheetah that has ever lived. That's a human thing to do. I'm just the smartest guy who's ever lived. It's like, first of all, probably not. Second of all, dear God, you're wasting time. Do the thing that matters. Don't, puff yourself up around it. So
what's the other question? How do you live when you discover that you're not the smartest guy that ever lived?
Yes.
I mean, you're deflated, aren't you?
Yes.
Because most people operate on the childhood egoism, the one where you were the center of the parents' attention.
Look at me.
Unless you had brothers you had to kill. And when you discover that you're not the center of the world, that's a deflating experience.
Exactly. Exactly. Unless you get it in a healthy context in which it's the other kind of deflating, where it gets rid of the mania and leaves you feeling centered and whole. Like, in a healthy traditional karate dojo, you're never given the opportunity to think you're the greatest and the smartest, because nobody, even the sensei, says he's not the greatest and the smartest. And you can see how much better the sensei is than you, because he can do all these katas you don't know how to do. He's got all these capabilities you yearn for. And so if you grow up in that context, you get used to this kind of thing that's closer to sophrosyne. It's not sophrosyne, it's a substitute for it. But it has that same, on the one hand, it's egotistical because you're pursuing this path towards greatness. But on the other hand, you can't pursue the path well unless you acknowledge that at no point will you ever be great. This is just your path of learning. This is the path that you're on. And, you'll get better than you are today if you work at it. But you don't worry about, well, where will I end up eventually? That's not your job. It's irrelevant. The people who worry about, could I beat you in a fight? Those are the people who never learn anything because they spend all their time trying to test themselves and prove themselves. It's the ones who are learning all the time that get better, who say, forget about where I rank on something. My rank doesn't matter. I just want to get on with the work. The work is what matters. So humanity has a huge variety of ways of expressing ego. And so for that reason, you sort of can't end up coming down for or against ego in Homo sapiens if you're trying to do justice to the question of what does it mean to us? Who are we? What is our ego to us? We can't just say, well, it's good or it's bad. That's too simple. It's central to the way our minds are constructed. And so everything depends on how the ego is integrated into the rest of us or not. You know, is it made the king or tyrant over us, or is it somehow?
But we will distort the truth for the sake of the ego.
Yes.
And of course, dear old Nietzsche, warning the world, you have forgotten pride, you have forgotten envy.
Yes.
Well, we moderns, we're too sophisticated for pride and envy. You want to feel pride and envy, you know, you want to feel some pride. Our city's full of boutiques. You can go and enjoy some pride for a couple of hours.
Yes.
We've got control of it, us moderns. And Nietzsche's he's come out and, hey, you've forgotten something that the medievals understood about human nature.
Yes. Yes. This is rich stuff. I mean, this is really great stuff.
Real fast, I would like, Rick, could you post the paragraph? For some reason, it's not in the chat for me. I was wondering if I missed it or it's just not here. Could you post the reading that we're discussing? Specifically that one, I think it's the one sentence that Stephen keeps coming back to that's like a real mouthful. I want to be able to look at it.
So there is the link to it. And then here's the first two sentences, including the one that Stephen has pointed us to rightly.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. And he posted it too. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Couldn't find that mute button. Couldn't find my cursor, actually. It's so small. My eyes are so weak. No, I wanted to talk a little bit about Manichaeism, you know, because it seems, I mean, I actually agree. I agree. I don't know, too long ago when I read Augustine, he was definitely, Manichaeism was bad. And I agreed and still agree that if there is a God, there is one God. That logically there can't be more. But this seemed to have opened up for the church the issue of will, human will, and its freedom. How did they solve the problem Manichaeism solved, and actually for most people solved superior, as it was a better answer than free will, because the devil made me do it. Wasn't me. I'm a good guy. But Satan makes me do things I don't want to do. And so free will, or I wouldn't say maybe they've gotten to free will early on, but certainly by the end of the medieval period, the concept of will is sufficient to overthrow the medieval epic itself, to end it, as will becomes the basis of not a solution of a problem within medieval theology, but the basis of modern non-theology, I don't know what we call it. So there's some good and bad here, that I tend to agree the church should have defeated, the medieval church, recognized the danger of Manichaeism, defeated it, and created a philosophical, theological space for human will that in the end overthrew the church itself and ended the medieval period. So enough of that.
No, that's great, Donald. Thank you. Yeah, the relationship of Augustine to Manichaeism is highly relevant here. You're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that he was raised Christian but turned away from it towards Manichaeism in his youth, much to his mother's distress, but then later rejects the Manichaeism, comes back to Christianity and writes the takedown. Some of the major theological takedowns of what's wrong with Manichaeism, it comes from the man who was on both sides of that, first Christian, then Manichaean, then Christian again. He had things to say about why it didn't work. And this goes to what Phil was saying earlier about the dialectic between, to what extent do the early church fathers genuinely believe and are willing to sacrifice for this theology, and to what extent are they being pragmatists and just saying, well, it has to include all the parts that have the major Christian populations, even if they don't make sense together, because otherwise the church will schism. And it is a recurring theme on every one of these periods of crisis in the medieval period is, which of these kinds of issues is this? Is this the issue where they're going to say, oh, well, I guess we have to include Revelations in the canon, even though we all hate it, because, we'd lose too many Christians if we kicked it out? Or is it going to be one of those cases like Augustine saying, I don't care how popular Manichaeism is, it's wrong because it dilutes monotheism. And, if we're not monotheists, what the hell are we? There's no point in going on unless we're going to stick being monotheists. So you will see the same sorts of things when we eventually get into the Trinity. What is the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? And there are a lot of ways you could bake that trio and end up with polytheism. And there is a heresy named for each one of those variations. And the church fought a long, hard battle to say they're absolutely not merely three separate people. We're not polytheists who worship three divinities. That is not what this religion is about, because they stuck to their guns on monotheism. They're like, we cannot sacrifice on that. That's got to stay central. But they also just inherited Jesus and the Father, so they had to, and there were enough references to the Holy Spirit, who is of course really important in Paul's theology. So they somehow had to get these three together back into being one again. And the difficulty of doing that explains centuries of theological battle in the early history of Christianity. And it continues to be a source of, for some of us, entertainment to this day, watching the struggles that people go through. It's part of what's different about modern versions of medieval religions, is that from the medieval perspective, none of them is genuinely a religion. All the things that Christians do today, hardly any of it would be fully recognized as that's medieval Christianity, by a medieval. They could right off the top of their head, they could give you lists of all the ways in which your theology is broken as a modern. And, chief among them being our relationship to the marketplace, which is a very non-medieval thing. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, what's on my mind is something that happened yesterday about Hegel. But before I get to that, I want to address Augustine in this sense. I mean, didn't Augustine in his Confessions show that he indulged in his earlier life? Thank God that he could have that, and now he could confess that that was wrong. Right? I mean, he would have to confess if that didn't happen, but I think that made him more mature or something. So he had a period of indulgence. Maybe that's all what we want. We all want to be obeying God, but not for now, God. Let me have some time off and self-indulging myself. I'll just say that in response, and it just seems interesting that he had that period. The thing about Hegel was interesting because yesterday I was in a group that talked about the early Greeks. Okay, so and it got to the it was really a discussion about the finite and the infinite. How the early Greeks already recognized there was a finite soul, and so therefore it could never really achieve the infinite, because the infinite involve a kind of infinity, the absolute understanding of everything. And so at the end, somebody argued that Hegel had a kind of infinity in some sense, and the leader group, who happened to be an extremely good mathematician, said, yeah, when I look at Hegel's infinity, it seems like a very dim and minuscule infinity, a small infinity. So he was complaining how that didn't suffice. And I came back and asked the question. I said, well, insofar as human beings, ever since the you know agriculture, we formed cities, we formed civilization, we formed societies, and in societies, it seems to me that societies are always governed by the relationship of sociology and politics, social political concerns. Okay. And if that's the case, it seems to me Hegel's infinity might be sufficient because Hegel's infinity was about statecraft. And so, therefore, in some sense, therefore, his infinity is good enough for government work. And the guy who's leading this, he just laughed. He laughed. He said, "Oh yeah, maybe it is good enough for government work. That's all government want. They don't need God's infinity. They just need this very dim infinity are good enough for government work." And maybe that's what we're dealing with, is like, because we all are constrained by the social political situation. So therefore, a kind of dimmed down infinity is good enough for government work. You can't expect everybody to be a high fluid mathematician. That's it, Phil.
Thank you,
Can you
Phil.
say something about that? Because that seemed like an interesting response.
I can't say something about that. It's going to come up over and over as we talk in the weeks ahead. It's good, but it's complex and it ties into all kinds of things we haven't got to yet. So I'm gonna let it hover as a spirit over our conversation this week and next week and the week after, and we'll come back to it repeatedly. And I'm gonna do the same thing with this second half of the second sentence of paragraph 10 that Stephen has pulled out for us. I'm not going to try to explain it all today because it's rich. There's a lot of stuff there, but we're going to keep coming back to it. It and your comment are just going to hover over us and be reference points, little strange attractors. I want to take us back to the first half of the second sentence, this issue of worldliness and worldliness being the scapegoat for evil. So now we don't need a devil. We can just say turning away from God is the evil. And in doing that, the emerging medieval theology is actually being truer, and Ari, correct me if I'm wrong, is actually being truer to traditional rabbinical Jewish theology than other parts of the Christian theology are, because this is emphasizing the importance of the relationship with God as being a source of goodness, and ignoring that relationship at your peril, that you're at your worst when you disregard this relationship that you're in. Now, this is kind of this is the recipe that they come up with to reject, that the Christians come up with to reject Manichaeism. And in that rejection, they're getting, tell me if I'm wrong, Ari, they're getting less modern Christian and more Jewish. That's a core Jewish idea, the monotheism, the relationship with God, and that it is in the.
Could you maybe say that again, a little bit more distilled, maybe? I'm tuned in, but there are certain things of what I guess from my own signal to noise ratio, it's like I'm listening to your radio program. I feel like you got a little staticky at some point.
Sure. Let me try this again. So there are a lot of what the medieval Orthodox Christians would call heretical versions of Christianity that go pretty Manichaean, that make the devil into a big deal, and that focus on evil. And there's all this evil, and how are we going to save ourselves from the evil? And that continues to this day, especially in America. American forms of Christianity tend to be very Manichaean, at least the mainstream politically oriented ones do. But what's happening around with Augustine of Hippo, whose name I misspelled, by the way, I just see in that comment. It's not Augustine of Hip. He's not a hippie. It's Augustine of Hippo, where the form that his rejection takes, they simultaneously have to be every bit as good as the Manichaeans in explaining why there's evil in the world, but to do so without propping up a second God, an evil God. And that their strategy for doing so is to say, it's not that there's an evil God. It's that when you turn away from your relationship with the one true God, when you neglect that relationship and you focus on things that please your body or your ego, which they've lumped together, the Christians have lumped together as worldliness, that's where evil comes from, that the source of evil comes from neglecting the relationship with God. What I'm saying is, and I'm asking, in doing that, in rejecting the two gods, the good God and the evil God, and explaining evil as turning away from the relationship with God, with the one true good God, is this not a way in which this early form of Christianity is trying to hew a theological line closer to Judaism than?
In a simple answer, I would say absolutely yes. In Judaism, I'll be honest, I don't know if it's a heretical thing, but it's more like it's just a long tradition of a lot of people saying a lot of things, and none of them are necessarily right and none of them necessarily wrong. And there's a lot of vagueness around evil. There's really in the Bible itself, there is no word for evil. There's only good and then not good. And the first time that not good is ever spoken is when man is isolated. It talks about man living alone. That's the first time you hear something is not good. And essentially, what modern rabbinic interpretation, if we're going to do that conversation where your parents are talking about the Republican part of being a dinosaur, and then you're like, oh, I like dinosaurs. If you remember that conversation, that's kind of what we have access to now, right? We don't know what they meant when they were talking about dinosaurs. So I'm certain that I have huge gaps in what's actually happening, but my understanding of the modern interpretation of the ancient era is very similar to what you're saying. Very, very similar. That it's this idea, and there's a famous, most core tenet of Jewish principles. It's called the Shema. The Shema is listen to God. And there's three paragraphs. The second paragraph specifically says that it's like the last part of the Bible in Hebrew. It's called Devarim. I guess I forget what the last book of the 5 books of Moses are in English, but in that book where Moses is giving his speech, he's basically talking about these curses and these blessings. And the curses are the evil that we would imagine that would befall yourselves. And it's from basically people being self-interested, and that they're forgetting that they were slaves, and that how this all accounts. The idea is that they believe that the power and success that they have comes from their own hands, and they forgot it comes from God. And that when you believe you are the master of your own destiny, or basically you worship your own self, that's when evil happens. So it's definitely this idea of turning away from God is maybe the signal, like the red light, green light, but I don't think that's essentially what it is. It's something about paying attention to the wrong things. I'm not exactly sure if that's a better way of saying it, but again, the source of evil in this case is clearly man has the ability as an image of God. If God is a creator, that means man is also a creator, and we have the ability to create good, and we have the ability to create evil. And the way somehow God lets us do that, right? He makes space for us to do these things. So when you turn towards God, you do less evil, and you fix your evil, and you do repentance and all those things. You see something's evil and you're like, oh, God doesn't want this, I'm going to fix it. As opposed to when you're just worshiping yourself and you think, I'm the master of my own destiny, I can do whatever I want. Then anytime you do evil, you don't recognize that you're actually doing evil, and then evil takes over. So that's kind of the Jewish explanation of evil, that it's an aspect of free will, that you can't have good things without some sort of thing to compare it to, which would then be, or its opposition, right? That it's balancing opposite. So if you happen to have good in the world, you have to be able to have evil in the world, because otherwise everything would be neutral, or basically there would be no freedom at all. There'd be no choice, right? You'd just be we'd all be running the exact same program, and humans wouldn't be able to think or do. And in order to think and do and have will, that means there has to be an evil that you can do. But again, this is like in the Jewish literature, this is an aspect of God that was endowed into man. Mm-hmm. And God's mostly like letting man do it on his own so that he can learn and grow up as this child species to hopefully some sort of Sophrosune species. And you have to go through the process of suffering and evil to learn your lesson.
Yes.
Right. I hope that's a good answer.
That's great.
For what you're saying.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So this is, I'm stressing this point because when moderns look back at the medieval period, we don't do so objectively or neutrally, because modernity defines itself in opposition to the medieval period. And its opposition is not based on the full medieval period, but it's based on the late corrupt medieval period. In the same way that the emerging medieval movement is defining itself not against the ancient period at its healthiest, but the ancient period at its sickest under Rome. So as a result, our natural tendency is to stereotype and oversimplify the medieval worldview. And that means that for us, as hard as it was to come to see the ancient worldview with some kind of authenticity, with some kind of integrity, it's going to be harder for us to do that with the medieval worldview. It's necessary to the project for this book that we get through the difficulties to the point where we can start to see, to look at the world in medieval ways when we need to. But it's going to be a hard journey because we have a lot more propaganda programmed into us about how we are supposed to properly misinterpret the medieval period in order to justify the modern period. So we're going to keep running into these traps. And one of them is when people are making, TV shows or movies in which people time travel back to the medieval period, what's depicted as normal in the medieval period is absolute gibberish. It's like a weird mixed up cross between Dark Age thing, Renaissance things, high Middle Ages things, but also Inquisition, stuff that happened later after the medieval period. It's mixed up with the Salem witch trials, which has nothing to do with the medieval worldview. That's a modern Protestant idea. I mean, all this stuff is sort of blenderized together. And so it's natural for people to assume that a normal part of the medieval theology was that people were always were worried about the devil. But under the core medieval Christian theology, that's not the dominant concern. It's just like Ari said, the dominant concern is closer to what in Greek is called hamartia, which is an archery term, and it means missing the mark. And that's the word for sin in the Greek, New Testament. Yeah, it's not that we chose evil. It's not that the devil made us do it. It's that there are, you can read the concept of hamartia from a sophrosune perspective and say, we are the species that has the capacity to miss the mark the widest in the pursuit of sophrosune. So the argument that's being made by the church fathers is that all attempts to define sophrosune in a worldly way, in terms of the things of this world, have been proven by the past 1,000 years, they're saying, as the ancient epoch is winding down, have been proven historically not to be reliable. And if they're not reliable, where are we supposed to turn for sophrosune? Where is something that can't be corrupted the way Rome was corrupted? And they're saying, well, God, the one true God who is wise and good, he knows our sophrosune. He knows what we ought to be doing. And so for us, sophrosune consists in hitting that mark of, trying to be true to God, trying to be open to God, receptive to God's message, and doing what God wants us to do. That's the medieval argument is that's where we will find the human approximation of sophrosune. And that when we turn away from that, we're missing the mark. Even if we're turning away from it to try to do, Aristotelian, arete, the Greeks are saying, the early church fathers are saying, that didn't work. Look what it led to. It led to the Alexandrian period and then the Roman period, all this massive corruption. So that's a failed promise and you shouldn't pursue it anymore. But God won't fail you. You might fail God, but God won't fail you. So pursue God and you will find your sophrosune. So that's what's going on with this critique of worldliness. They're saying worldliness means you're going to miss the mark because you're going to rely on these corrupt, unreliable methods to try to figure out what the right thing is to do. Does this all make sense as a kind of, in terms of understanding the core theological framework that's at the heart of medievalism? And we talked some in the previous couple of weeks when we were going through paragraph, what I was calling paragraph 8, but now we're calling paragraph 9, the preceding paragraph. We talked about where he was doing his little summary of Rome and its corruption. We were talking about how Where am I going with this? No, I gotta let it go. Too many thoughts in my head at the same time. Why is okay? While I'm trying to remember, Donna, please come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, I just want to mention this. This is a movie directed by Ridley Scott, recent, called The Last Duel. I've watched it 3 times now. Part of it because it's Ridley Scott, and also because of the actors involved. But it's in medieval times. It is about an honor duel, and seen from the perspective of 3 different people in medieval times. But probably one of the most interesting to me is the perspective of the woman who has been wronged by this Lothario, and then her stalwart, supposedly Christian husband, who was anything but in principle. And Ridley shows this from in time, the same time, from these 3 different perspectives. You're talking about different perspectives in this period. I think it gives insight. I respect it because of Ridley Scott, to some extent. But I also think, from what I understand of the making of the movie, there were some actors there that really wanted it to be historically correct, and they insisted on quite a bit of research. So, in the end, it's a story. It's a grand story. But I just want to mention that The Last Duel. It's recent.
I appreciate it because I missed this one. I didn't know this one came out, and it's
it's not very popular. Believe me, it's not going to win any awards. It's been blackballed in a way, but it's very interesting.
It sounds like my kind of film.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Donna.
Sure.
And that helps me. I remembered what I was going to say to tie off where we were in this too. But I'm going to save that because we got hands, and I'm gonna put you guys first. So James, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks, Rick. In relation to Aquinas, are you going to mention or discuss Duns Scotus, who was responding to Aquinas with his idea of univocity, and that seems to resolve the problem of Manichaeism, and the idea of univocity is interesting. Also, Spinoza too comes after, right? And almost also in a similar vein, that this kind of monism, there, that he's advocating that there's only one substance. God is one being, and we are just part of that one being. So there's no distinction between the being of God and our being, because we're part of God, and so that seems to be a response to this kind of Manichaeism, or
that's right,
the view of Aquinas, which is a kind of a equivocity as opposed to univocity.
Yes, yeah. It's one of the things that's going to happen over the next. Actually, I think to this day it continues. Is the Catholic Church is always on the hunt for theologians who can get right all of these difficult questions that the church has fought its way through for centuries, but who can get it right in an elegant fashion that pulls it together and makes it intuitive. What they're trying to avoid is any kind of house of cards feeling of it's just like a whole bunch of rules and you have to do this and not this, but believe this, but don't believe. They don't want it to be a mess of contradictions. They want it to hold together and cohere. So whenever you get, and this is one of the ways you get these incredible visionaries writing in the medieval period, including some amazing nuns, they catch on when they find some difficult sequence of theology, this but not this, but yes, the other thing, and they find the unifying principle that makes it compelling and elegant. So what my goal is going to be over the next 2 years is not just to trace out some kind of tangled labyrinth, but to find these core issues and then take us to the writers like Peter Abelard and Heloise, who find ways to really boil this stuff down into its punchiest form. Because that's how they end up pulling, that's how you end up defeating Manichaeism, is not through rational argument, although you have to develop that, but through the follow-on to rational argument, which is finding the persuasive way. And by the way, this should sound like mythos, right? When we were talking about chapter 4, finding the persuasive way that you can encapsulate that argument in a way that's unforgettable and emotionally moving and meaningful to people. It's only when they can get to that point that they can move on past a heresy like Manichaeism. Until then, it's a long struggle where people are searching.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify something. What James is saying isn't like these, like Spinoza specifically, but also Aquinas, aren't these like 1,000 years later? Are we gonna talk about, like, this is more of a meta question on this group? Are we happy to jump around from the medieval epoch, such a big period? Are we want to go 1,000 years in the future, or do we want to stay back in the early parts and do it more of a linear chronology? Or are we happy to jump ahead, like to Spinoza or Aquinas, where they're giving these maybe very eloquent things? But I feel like, again, that's like a time travel movie. We've gone like 1,000 years. I feel like it would be somehow really, at least for my sake, but maybe this is a democratic thing, or just Rick, you have a understanding of how it should go. I feel like we should develop what happened 1,000 years ago first, yes, before we start to, right? Because I don't know. I don't think we have developed a clarity of what's happening 1,000 years ago yet. And you're talking about this. We have the beginning picture, we have the end picture. I think it'd be really nice, or at least for me, where I'm more of a beginner here. I want to make sure that these things stay separate before we start mixing them together. I don't know if that makes sense.
I give people a pretty free rein about what they want to bring up, but once it's been brought up, I also try to circle us back to where we left off. Partially Kenneth's text helps us with that, but partially it's exactly what you're saying, Ari. I too am trying to keep us, circling back to where we were earlier in the timeline so we can continue. I don't think it's like wrong in any way to bring in these other things that occur to us, because this is all interconnected. But to see where the point of gravity is, I'm going to try to move that through chronologically through us. So right now,
I didn't want to criticize anybody. I was more asking, you're saying, what's the point of focus right now? And so their point of focus is like 1,000, or I don't even know where we are, like a lot earlier in the timeline, if I'm not mistaken.
300s, 400s, right around there.
300s, 400s, okay.
And that's because that's late Roman Empire, and at that point, the new medieval theology, it's not at the beginning, it's emerging, and it's starting to have real serious arguments with the other dominant philosophies of their era. I mean, like this issue with Augustine having converted from Christianity to Manichaeism and then converted back and critiquing Manichaeism. This is something that happens at a particular period in the development and by looking at those things, it helps us to see, why did it arise? Sure, but also, how did it become the new worldview? Why did that happen? In hindsight, it's easy to look at these things as though it's just the forces of history following an inevitable outcome. But if Joe were here today, he'd remind us about the dance between agency and contingency. And it's like there is a tremendous amount in the emergence of these things that is contingent, and if we don't look at the time and the place, then we're going to miss why that happened in the way that it did. So that's why I keep us circling back. But of course, I'm fine with people introducing whatever strikes them. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I sort of have a slightly different opinion. Seems like we all live in the modern era, and we can't help but bring our perspective to that to a certain degree. Okay, so therefore, let's say in archaeology, you find some object, you don't know what the hell it is. You interpret it that way, and hopefully, in doing so, you begin to understand it a little bit better and uncover something more authentic. But your first look at it is like, yeah, it looked like a vase. We're familiar with that, but it might not be. Okay, so I think anytime you do archaeology is like, yeah, you're fraught with some kind of like, a flashlight that's shining the modern period into the background. So that's one thing. And I rather enjoy openness? Because I remember one time somebody said, "You're so authoritative about this thing," and I kind of objected, and you were a little bit pissed off. I said, "No, you're the least authoritarian person I know." So that was the reason why I like the fact that you're not authoritative in some sense. So, uh, what I was going to say something else. Shoots, now I've forgotten what was. Oh yes, uh, when Donna brought up that movie, it immediately got me flashback to storytelling. Uh, uh, Kurosawa's Rashomon. I think that's one of his greatest movies, if not the greatest, because it was about different perspective. Some women was rape and I think murder in a scene. And many people were discussing from different perspectives. By the way, those people were not there, okay? So that they didn't know what the hell's going on. Finally, the woodsman came along and he claimed that he knew was there. He was there, okay? And when they showed the picture, they actually described the moment when that happened. He was describing it. But the camera work was very, very interesting. When you look at that movie, the camera work was very, very interesting because as he described it, the camera work was spinning around and the trees were spinning around and it was very confusing. It seems to be saying that the human limited mind is incapable of understanding because everything is blurry and fuzzy and spinning around, like, so therefore our limited minds will never get it right on sight. So Kurosawa had spin the thing around to say that's where we are, is that we really can't be objective. We could only be subjective in some sense. It's a beautiful movie to describe the confusion that we are in. So that was a very great movie that he described it that way. So even the guy who witnessed it doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
Yes.
Or else he's lying, one or the other. Okay.
Thank you, Phil. It's a great example. Anyone who hasn't seen Rashomon yet, it's not going to be Star Wars. You're not going to be on a roller coaster. So, take your time and be patient with it. But do yourself a favor and watch it because Phil's not wrong. It's a masterpiece, hugely influential. And it's because he directly confronts this problem of the reliability of human understanding of the world. And the fact that it takes until the final witness to hear from anybody who actually saw what happened. Everybody else is telling what they think, and what they think is based on having not witnessed a single part of it. And it sets you up for the point where it's like, oh, finally a witness, someone who actually knows what he's talking about. But as Phil says, he's like, yeah, but it was confusing. So, there's problems there too. This is what we're doing. So I want to underscore what Phil said. There's a way in which comparing what Augustine says to what Spinoza says, especially if you're familiar with Spinoza, can be helpful because it's comparison contrast, right? The basic tricks we learn in school for how do you approach a subject you've never been at before. Well, first compare it to things you know, then contrast it with things you know, and then that starts the process of triangulating off of a single perspective. And if you do enough of that, then it sets you up to where you can finally jump out of all of those, ostensibly, into trying to see it in its own lights. And that's kind of what Kenneth is doing for us here. So right now, all of chapter 5 really is the push off. This whole chapter is about the rejection of the ancient period. It's the comparison and contrast between the newly emerging medieval and the previous ancient. So it's understandable that as moderns, we're going to be using the third perspective to try to help us understand both of the other two. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I thought the bit with Rashomon that each of the three characters describe themselves in the more perfect term. But the woodsman who was watching from the bushes, who saw it all, and doesn't reveal that till the end, saw the human all too human at play. None of them were really giving an accurate impression of what was going on. They were grandiosing their own perspective. I was just going to say, well, the Manichaeism made a comeback in the Middle Ages, though, in the new form, the Waldenesians and the Albigensians. And that seems to have suddenly appeared when you had, they must have always been there, but it somehow just sort of came together at the time. Those people who were preaching against the vanity of the church. It's quite obvious, you know, that it's a bit like, you know, the film where they're arguing with the Franciscans that, you know, well, we know Jesus was poor, but doesn't mean we have to be poor, do we? And so, you know, you got the bishops and all that going around in their fine robes, and you know, people are pointing, saying, "Well, that's all vanity, isn't it? You preach against vanity, you talk about humility, and then you go and do the opposite." So somehow there was a comeback of the Manichaeans amongst a bourgeois, a middle class, more or less, who decided to live their lives in a certain way which they felt was more virtuous. Now, the Manichaeans seem to have made this thing about, actually, well, this is where I say the Manichaeans are even more anti-worldly than the church, so much so that the church had to temper their beliefs. But they knew that people were driven by worldly temptations and they lived their life in a certain way, but they had a path where when you were approaching death, you gave up the world. And this is the point where you're reaching this extremely pure state, so you would go into the other worlds, free of the world. But this is the interesting thing, is why the church was so hostile towards them. This is a big question. Hostile at the time of Augustine. We have a sort of repetition 800 years later, and the church is utterly hostile again. You know, the famous line when one of the knights who's doing the massacre says, "Oh, a lot of these people seem to be very good, pious Christians." And the prelate says, "Don't worry, my son, kill them all. God will sort out the good ones from the bad ones in heaven."
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and for this reason, you know, part of the reason why we're going to go through this linearly, this period, is for that very reason. You know, the medieval epoch goes through different phases in which different qualities of its worldview are at the fore. And as you point out, you know, you get a repetition later in a new form of the kinds of things that Augustine is dealing with in his era, but that's like 800 years apart. And, you know, before Augustine and after Augustine, very different circumstances prevail. And so watching the same worldview develop over time and also get exercised by different circumstances helps us to distinguish, and now I'm back to Aristotle, what is inessential from what's essential to the worldview. How much of it is just its response to contingency, and how much of it is the core beating heart of the worldview. It's going to take us some work to get at that, because it's not going to simplify into the kinds of stereotypes that modernist propaganda about the medieval epoch have prepared us to expect. So the thing that I'd forgotten that I was trying to get us to on worldliness is this. The ancient Roman, late Roman Empire was deeply corrupt. It was militarily powerful. It was the most powerful force on earth. So that made it seem irresistible and inevitable, right? But it was also deeply corrupt, and it was unacceptable, and people's lives were intolerable under it. It had to stop. And the problem was that the distorted form of the ancient worldview that it had grown into by that late stage of the ancient epoch, it included a tremendous amount of fatalism, right? So as you remember, the ancient Greeks had this idea that character is fate, but that you can cultivate, and indeed you have a duty to cultivate your character. And if you change your character, you change your fate. As you grow and become a different person, new options open up to you that weren't available to you earlier in your life. And if you're growing in a good direction, other bad options that might have been easily accessible earlier in your life, you might be able to close them off to you later in life so that they're not even temptations hardly anymore. And you see this with people who've gone through, who are people who are born with the alcoholic gene. If they go through the process of learning to accept that they've got this and it's in them and that it wants to act, but it can't be trusted, they can be good about not crawling into the bottle later in their life with a greater resilience and profundity and persistence than was ever possible earlier in their life. Even if earlier in their life they went through a period where they didn't crawl into the bottle, it was more by chance. They just weren't tempted the right way. But later in life, having developed their character to the point where they accept this about themselves, those same temptations wouldn't work on them. So their goodness has a greater resiliency. It can take a blow and recover. And that's what you want in character, right? You want to develop it to the point where it can handle the vicissitudes of life and still point you in a Soprasune-like direction. That's what your job is. But that requires a society that allows for a certain kind of mobility, right? And how people are enslaved under these ancient slave societies differs over time, changes over time, develops over time. When you're in the worst circumstances where there aren't any freedoms open to you and there's no choices, no chances, no opportunities to learn to be literate, to develop your character, what have you, you're kept in a sort of a characterological flatland. And when you're in a characterological flatland, then character truly is fate. You really are just at the whim of your circumstances because you're never allowed to develop into the kind of person who has the resilience to transcend your circumstances. This issue of fatalism versus free will is closely related to these kind of larger issues. We're going to talk about that this week and next week. So what the rising medieval movement is rebelling against is this late flatland form of the ancient worldview in which character has become fate, and character has become tied inexorably to class, where class is hardened into caste. For most people, there is no mobility, there are no choices, and if you aren't at the very top, your life is incredibly constrained. But if you are at the top, things are so volatile now that you have to play the Byzantine dance of politics exquisitely well. Because if you don't, you're going to get assassinated and replaced. So their lives don't have any freedom either. It's one of my favorite lines from Marx. Of all the things that I've let go, some things I've kept. My favorite line in Marx is he's basically saying that this idea that under capitalism, there's good guys and bad guys, and the proletariat's the good guys and the bourgeoisie's the bad guys. He says that's not right at all. He says as capitalism develops, it will reach a point of ossification where nobody gets what they want. Nobody's having a complete human existence. On the one hand, you have this class of people who are allowed to make things but not own them. And on the other hand, you have this class of people who are allowed to own things but not make anything. Because if they ever turn away from managing the money and the corporations to just take some time for themselves to build a house or do something with their hands, then they lose out to their competitor who stayed focused full time on how to, beat the competition. So they're denied this whole side of human existence, which is the ability to create things. And so as a result, it's not that the capitalists are getting what they want and the working class isn't. It's that, when it gets to the late stage, nobody's getting what they want. And that critique doesn't just apply to capitalism. That's a Hegelian epoch critique. And it applies to late stage medievalism. And it applies to the late stage ancient world under the Roman Empire. The emperors aren't getting what they want. The slaves aren't getting what they want. Everybody's stuck in the system that doesn't give them the freedom to develop their character. You remember that part of education in the ancient world that was about the necessity of diversity that's built into the concept of arete. Phil's good at different things than I am. We have to have a society that will allow Phil to explore those things that he can do that I can't do as well. Because if we allow that, then Phil's going to be able to blossom into these arete that I can't blossom into. And conversely, the things that I can blossom into that he can't. There has to be that kind of room to explore if you ever want to get a Leonardo da Vinci out of your culture. If you flatland everything and restrict everybody to tight roles, then almost every Leonardo da Vinci that's ever born will just by circumstances happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and will never develop those capabilities. And now your culture is denied those gifts. And so, says Aristotle, your culture will fail. To survive, you have to let individuals cultivate their arete. And that requires a certain amount of looseness and unpredictability and, you know, what Nora Bateson would call somathesy, the ability to be alive to what's actually happening in front of you instead of to the rigid or ideological recipe that you're trying to impose on the world. Instead, you stay alive to what's actually happening, and so that you can notice if Phil's got this gift for art and say, well, I had him pegged as a ditch digger, but I think maybe I bet somebody else should dig the ditches. I think maybe I should set Phil up with a palette in the studio and see what happens. You know, I got to let him grow, or we're going to be denied those gifts. You know, that's ancient Rome had reached the point where that didn't happen anymore. And so the society was dying. I mean, it was using the Aristotelian concept. It was dead inside already. And when you're dead inside already, when you're so rigid and ossified, you're so strictly trying to do the right thing all the time, the result is that when new circumstances arise, like new invasions, you don't respond to them correctly, and then you fall apart. You become brittle. This is what the medievals are opposed to. And it's part of why the new medieval worldview could rise under these incredibly restrictive circumstances to become a competitor and eventually replace the ancient world, is that this was all the other worldview, like Stoicism is trying to encourage Romans to accept their circumstances, you know, to be cool, to be, you know, steadfast and stoic, to be able to put up with it. But Christianity is saying, I don't care if you persuade me that the laws of nature themselves demand that things be the way they are, because I have a transcendental conception of right and wrong that's more important than your laws of nature. Those good things are worth fighting for, even if everybody in the world thinks it's hopeless. It's still worth fighting for because God is great. And what God's got to offer is better than all of these powers that stand arrayed before us. It's better to march into almost certain defeat for the slim chance that maybe we could win anyway, because at least we're doing the right thing. That is to say, medievalism is teaching this concept of not accepting tyranny, no matter how powerful it is, no matter how much you tell yourself it's just human nature. This is just the way things are. We just have to accept it. The transcendentalism, the otherworldliness, the spirituality of Christianity is offering this by holding worldliness in contempt, by putting all of the cards of meaning into the hands of God and saying that's the only place we're going to find our sophrosyne. They're creating the possibility of putting steel into your spine, even in hopeless situations. That's a new and interesting thing. It's like the craze for martyrdom in the 100s, 200s, and 300s. All these holy men are saying, God, I hope that I can die for God. Instead of being afraid, they're writing in their diaries and journals. It's like the Viking thing is going to be 500 years later. I can only dream that I'm going to go forth and preach God's, message to the masses, and somebody will crucify me, because then it will prove that I did the right thing, that I stood on the right. It will show my contempt for death and my attachment to doing the right thing. It will show the steel in my spine, that I care about doing the right thing more than I care about winning in any worldly sense. This is an interesting transformation of the warrior ethos contempt for death that we see people engaging in the 400s BCE, right? When they were killing themselves in public just to prove that they weren't afraid of death. That idea had been gone for a long time by the time we're talking about the late Roman Empire. But here they are resurrecting this old ethos, but putting it to a new purpose. It's not to prove you personally, have such great character. It's to prove that your attachment to God's character is so strong that you're willing to sacrifice all the good worldly things in order to try to pursue Sophrosyne. How important is Sophrosyne to you? And the medievals, they've got an argument, and it's a compelling argument. You watch somebody do that. You watch somebody scoff at death, and lots of people are going to be scared and say, well, I never want to do what he did. But a certain percentage of people are going to walk away inspired. That inspiration is something that had been missing for a long time by the late Roman Empire. So you can see why that would catch fire, right? At a time when people are feeling hopeless. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, yeah. Very exciting talk. Mostly had some really insightful ideas, but I want to pose them in a playful way. Key here being playful, meaning that I might sound a little bit like purposely like I'm arguing aside, but I'm really more trying to be like a character in a lawyer who's, just advocating. And it has to do with something you mentioned more earlier in your last beautiful soliloquy of talking about trying to uncover what we can get as close to the truth of what an epoch is, and trying not to get lost in, as Phil would say, the biases of the modern. But another bias that you pose that I really want to challenge here, and not that it's wrong, it's just a weird misconception, which is a fancy way of saying wrong, that this idea that what is essential is matched up to where we have agency in a situation. Like we're going to reveal the medieval man's character. We're trying to look for the essential piece of him is exactly where he has agency. And then all the stuff that's contingency, we're going to say that's non-essential. And I think that was either you had quoted someone in the name of like Aristotelian or Platonic thinking that what's essential is where man has free will. And at least from the way the brain works, so this is almost like the physical laws that govern reality don't work this way. What's contingency is, if we want to use a metaphor here, or more of an analogy, if life is a game, the contingencies are all the rules that we have to abide by. These are the things you can't control, you have to do. And therefore you'd say, oh, well, then let's look at how the player plays the game within those rules. That is the measure of the player. You're going to see all the things he's possibly able to do in that game. But the point here is that he's still just playing that game. And it reveals much more about a light and shadow relationship, almost in the Platonic form sense, that you can't separate between contingency and agency. Because under certain circumstances, let's say if there is such a person who's a natural warrior, well, at a wedding, he's an awful, horrible person making a mess and he's a barbarian. But you put him on the battlefield and every woman wants to have his babies now, as opposed to everybody wants to reject him, right? So this doesn't necessarily, the contingencies are highly essential. They are another type of component. It's like, if we're doing, again, storytelling, I think we've said this earlier, Phil, that everything that humans do in terms of measurement and observation is a storytelling. That's the way we do descriptions. This is basically Daniel Kahneman's behavioral economics theory. Everything is storytelling, and storytelling is basically like we have in plays. There are objects and there are backgrounds. And the contingencies are really the backgrounds, and the objects are the characters and what we see, what kind of motion is available for them. But it's a really big fallacy to think that you could somehow remove the background, the scene, and just have the objects and there have any sort of meaning revealed. Right? This is impossible. So to say that contingency is not essential is a huge mistake. And in terms of the way we make concepts or linguistic words and emotions, that we are constructing a reality all the time based on the likeliest probabilities of the contingencies. Right. So it's really like axiomatically from first principles, if you're doing a math style thing, contingencies are the basis for agency. Right. And so to try and remove one from the other, we could just give a different language in this case of what's essential and non-essential, or which part of like if we're looking at an image and you focus in on one part, it's not to say the other part of the image is gone. it's just been mystified. So in this case, I would say that maybe if we're looking at agency in terms of a certain type of essential qualities, that makes a lot of sense because those are just different from the essential qualities of the contingency. But
Right.
I really want to be clear that I think it's a huge bias, or at least a certain kind of baggage we're smuggling in if we want to say contingencies are not essential.
I agree. You're
Okay.
absolutely right, and that was an important.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's what, but the important thing is, I don't know if that's exactly what you meant. Going back to be more like me instead of this arguing lawyer plain guy. Me personally, I don't know what you meant when you said that. There's definitely a nugget of delicious truth in there, but it requires some more polishing and revealing before we get to it.
Yeah, I can fix it. I from what you're saying, I can see what I said wrong. And what I mean to say is this. Characters expressed in the world through the dialectic of agency and contingency. It's both of them, right? You don't see the full picture unless you see both of them in action. If you only ever see agency, you don't know how deep the aim is, right? Is it just skin deep, and you only do that when you're not disrupted or tempted? Because then that doesn't tell us about the full depth of your character. But if all we get is contingency, then we never get to see what you're aiming at. It's like you're an archer and everybody's constantly jarring your arm, and you never once hit the target. We can't even tell from where the arrows are where your target was. We need at least sometimes when your arm isn't jarred to figure out what you're aiming at. So between the two of them, to get kind of what is the intent and how deep is the support for it, we need both agency and contingency in a dialectic. And so we need to be able to look at the full range of things that happens throughout the epoch. And that's true for the medieval worldview. It's like, what does it do under stress in times of difficulty? And that tells us something. That gives us the contingent perspective on character. And then what does it do during times
I wanted
of
to say real fast, you were making a very interesting point. I don't know if you're realizing you're making it, but it sounds like you're saying this, is that you study the contingencies, and you'll notice then when his arm is being knocked and not. And then you can study contingencies long enough to see when sometimes he's actually aiming. So studying the contingencies reveals the agency.
That's right. Right. So you kind of want to see both. It's one of the critiques I have with the problem of storytelling being that you find out what a character is when you put them under pressure. That's been the theory of storytelling for thousands of years in the Western tradition. And the problem I have with it is I feel like then you're only seeing half of their character. You also want to see their character when they're not put under pressure. And you want to combine the two, and really see, the two different perspectives on who somebody is. And so that was what I meant, but not what I said. And because I said it the way I did, it was absolutely wrong. And I'm glad you corrected it. So thank you for that, Ari. These things are all recorded, right? So it's important that we.
It was just good fun, and we're just having some good fun. No worries.
Fun, but we can find an opportunity to make those corrections. We want to do it. We want to set the record right. So thank you for that, Phil. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I agree with Ari, except I use different words. The words is identity and difference, or because I think the contrast is important, because I think when we focus only on the identity, we forget about the contingency of the difference that's always looking around. I see it on a different level as the relationship between figure and ground. You focus on the figure, but the ground is always there that emerge and become the figure. And so if you are too focused on the figures themselves, then in a sense you eliminate the possibilities that arise from the ground and the difference. So I think that's why you don't want a society that's ossified into these are what it is. That seems like that actually does seem like a metaphysical structure, And what I wanted to get at before Ari had that what he said and what I agree with is, like Heidegger wrote the book Being and Time. Okay, time is the framing reference. How come nobody wrote the book Being in Space? Right? I mean, like, seems to me you live in a different space, whether it's a whole different part of the world or whether it's mountainous versus flatlands. Being in space creates something else. To the degree that in a modern society, we came close to having a globalized, at least economic structure. And then it seems to me there's a third thing, which is character being, which is what you're talking about. It takes a long time for that unification of a globalization thing to have a unity of one sort of character, right? Because if you see the Japanese, you see the Chinese, you see, somebody at Ethiopia, I mean, that space and that time uh, completely transform the interior. I don't know whether you want to call that the soul or the character of a person. So therefore, in a sense, there's at least a tripartite relationship between being and time, being in space, and being and the development of the character. I mean, like, so unless you had like hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years for the character to be unified under one structure, you're never going to have the same character as you go around. Now, to the degree that we can do some traveling, and experience a different culture, we really see the third part, which is the character that arises from time and space. To the degree that we talked about epochs, seems to me we're also focusing on being in time, as if there's not an epoch of traveling to a different part of the world, you know, in some sense. So maybe somebody should write the book Being in Space.
Maybe they should.
Or is Einstein right? Space and time are not separate. Being in space time.
Being in space time.
I don't know. It's like, because it seems to me space and time is so fundamental in terms of our relationship to the world that in some sense we characterize that. But to talk about epoch seems to me you're putting prejudice on being in time rather than something else as well. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Maybe I don't have enough wisdom to write being in space, but somebody ought to.
It reminds me of Robert McKee's book about script writing, story, which is really great book if you want to get a insight into the Aristotelian conception of story, because he really goes back to Aristotle's definition. And he's been hugely influential in screenwriting. And lots of people have read Robert McKee's book. I've read Robert McKee's book multiple times. And one of the things he talks about is how often a bad screenwriter neglects setting, the time and the space element. He says, anybody can write a crappy story that maybe passes the time, but that hardly anybody wants to go back and revisit because it's so empty. There's just not much. You don't feel much at stake. He says, but what's really hard but what's really rewarding is when you can write a story in which the setting, the time and the space matter. This could only have happened to this character in this time and space, and they are who they are because of their setting. And the changes they're able to make in the world because of the way they conceive of the world is tied to their setting. It says those are the stories that we rewatch over and over and over. We just keep coming back to them because we can feel the juice of the meaning of the dependency between the setting and the person. Their worldview makes them who they are. And so, we're going to try to do that by the time we get to Joan of Arc, to have the medieval conception clearly enough in our minds that we can see her story from her perspective and not from our perspective. And that's ultimately what this exercise in this book is about, is trying to learn to look at these different perspectives, in terms of their setting. So the modern world is a very global world because it's economic genocide. It's based on the concept that there should be only one economic system and it should rule the whole world. And it inherited that concept from the medieval world, which said there should be only one religion. Which inherited it from the ancient Roman conception that there should be only one polis, although that was not true to the ancient concept, since it was a distortion. But before the modern epoch, it wasn't as easy to talk about the whole world. as it is now. You know, the ideologies associated with the marketplace are at such a point where even people who reject those ideologies have been exposed to them their whole lives. I think there's like one island in the Indian Ocean that has successfully repelled every attempt at contact. But everywhere else, even in the Amazon where there are, quote, uncontacted tribes, they know an enormous amount about us, even though we don't know much about them, because we're unavoidable. We're everywhere, right? So there's a way in which you can talk about the modern epoch as a global phenomenon that you can't do with the medieval epoch. There are multiple medieval groups. It's not just Europe. I mean, we've got medieval China, we've got medieval Japan. There's a medieval India. There may or may not be medieval Mesoamerican societies. We're still trying to tease out the archaeology there. But there's plenty of places that at the same time those were going on, in the places those were going on, there's plenty of other places in the world that were living in an entirely different way that was not remotely medieval. And so we can't talk about it as a global phenomenon the way that we talk about the modern epoch. Time and space, right? That's what you made me think about. And it was a reminder I meant to give, a couple months ago. We had said it about halfway through the discussion of chapter 4 and had not gotten back to it yet. That it was one of the points I was going to make when we got into the medieval section, that we're going to, before we're done with the medieval section, we're going to have to spend at least a little time with medieval Africa and medieval China and medieval Japan, some of these others, and compare and contrast to see how much fits across. So Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say something about time in particular, and it might apply to space as well. But us little blobs of meat only perceive the effects of time. We don't actually know what time is. We just see it affecting us in some way. And it could be equally true of space, but everywhere I go, people are talking about time as if they know exactly what it is. They think time is a wind-up clock. But again, that's only an effect of time. It's not what time actually is. It's talking about the worldly. Again, we can talk about it in terms of the recent era that, for example, famously, the 1980s comes up with a worldliness which just tops the rest of history. I mean, you could get some of the early, famous capitalists or even Henry Ford. At the end of the day, he just thought his business was about making a living. And you were just there, it was just there to support the life. Of course, post-World War II, we had the sort of like the hippie movement showed up, and the hippie movement was rejecting worldly values. And oddly, after a very small space of years, embrace worldliness to an extent that they'd never seen before. These hippies called their parents materialists and then became materialist in a sense that would have shocked Henry Ford, who would have thought, well, at the end of the day, you're just being somebody and you make money to support that, to make your life more comfortable or blah, 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 blah. But no, then Gordon Gekko comes along and he's worshipping the worldliness. So much so, as you said, he doesn't really have much time for himself. He seems to just live for the thrills of company acquisition. And supporting his whole ideology is at his best when he's telling Congress that, this is what it's all about, man. Just sacrifice yourself to worldliness. So we're living with this now. I mean, if I was a kid, if I can remember the atmosphere that I knew in the 60s or 70s, it's been blotted out by a worldliness, a worship of the world and a worship of material goods. Like just wasn't in people back then. Now you've been bombarded. Very sophisticated advertising. And there's a generation now that wouldn't even know of a culture which was advanced, sophisticated, 1960s, 50s, whatever, but just wasn't as worldly as it is now. And grab anyone from that time and they'll say, yeah, there's important things besides the worldly affairs. Now, what are you talking about, dude? There is nothing but the worldly affair. Get with the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Hey, Stephen, I remember exactly when the hippies became the yuppies.
Some of them.
The younger
Well, not all of
generation
them.
doesn't know
Well,
that.
some of them, yes.
Doesn't know the meaning of the word yuppie.
Yeah. Yeah, there were splits, right? The movement only appeared to be a unified movement for a few short years, and then pretty quickly their character caused them to separate into different groups.
Natalia was asking me a few days ago, oh, what's a yuppie? I've heard other old guys using this term. I'll just tell her that Phil mentioned it as well, so it used to be well known.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, I mostly want to respond to Phil that if I write the book Being in Spacetime, I will definitely tell the story of this discussion. And there is a significant yet small chance I might write something like this, because I want to talk about this discussion in terms of explaining and pointing out some interesting bias we have towards time versus space, as we'll just use Stephen as a perfect example. Nowhere in that last beautiful, eloquent presentation he gave us did he mention the value of what's happening in space. He's talking about time the whole time. And history is the exact same bias. It's all about time. Looking at literally, it's about time. And this is what stories seem to do primarily. But I think, again, that primariness is a fiction, because the space is also telling the story. And we don't really, I don't have a robust way of describing that, but I'm about to, in terms of what perhaps the brain and definitely physics does in terms of dealing with this. In terms of general relativity, which is exactly space-time, which is based on what are called manifolds, or spaces that you can break up geometrically, and you describe with a motion in there. If you look at time from a very physical point of view, which also makes sense intuitively, time is simply motion. It's just motion. And it's the rate at which things move is also the amount of, so to speak, how much time is going on in there. You could say a certain amount of time has passed, and this is how much things have moved. And then the thing is, well, what is the other thing is space, which is things move in the middle of. And the important thing here is when we do things in physics, like the fancy stuff of both quantum stuff, that's on the small scale, and the general relativity on the big scale, there's one principle that unites them that is, again, a relationship famously. All of physics is broken into two dynamics. Either modernly, it's something called the Lagrangian, which has to deal with spaces, and the Hamiltonian, which deals with time. And for anybody who's a math person here, the functions are measuring the action, and all you're doing is integrating over time for the Hamiltonian, or you're integrating over space for the Lagrangian. Literally all of physics, in modern sense, uses one of these two mechanics. And you're either talking about how objects are moving in a fixed space, or you have things that are independent of space moving in time. And this sounds a lot like thoughts, which have nothing to do with space. They're independent of space. When I think of the color blue, I'm not putting it as space. And similarly, if I want to experience the world I'm looking at right now, it doesn't seem like there's time at all. It's just space right in front of me. And so the brain is very naturally dividing reality, as it seems to be, a relationship between space-time in terms of there's a space way to deal with things, and there's a time way of dealing with things. And then how does this whole lecture thing that I got a little crazy on go back to our discussion? That we are so obsessed. If you want to talk about Nietzsche talking about us being obsessed with reason, I'm claiming we're obsessed with time, and we should have a much more careful perspective on space And it's to some degree that space is almost exclusively understood through sensory perception of some sort, and time is purely imaginary. And now you're going, oh, are we living in an imaginary world, or are we living in the real world? The contingencies that we're actually looking at need to be valued more in space. So I wonder, like, almost geographically, you could say why this is important is, let's say, and the Bible does this kind of stuff. Let's say there was a famine right before Augustine decides to turn back to a Christian. Let's say he was, so you might say, oh, maybe because of this horrible suffering of seeing the famine occur, that drove him to make his decision. It's an extra element of contingency that I don't know if we can add back into the story. But my major problem with philosophy in general is it gets lost in a world of time and objects, and it very oftentimes misses the context of some physical reality that's driving the situation, not unlike why those people are demanding that Manichaeanism is there. Is it because there's a plague? Is there some sort of war going on? Is there some sort of, I know we do this a lot in this group, which is why I love it when we talk about the ancient era. We talked about spaces a lot. And I feel like that's getting, that might, or let's say it, frame it in a positive way. I would very much like to retain that excellent element of examination, of looking at space's relationship with time, and not just getting world lost in what people said and what time it was said.
Yes, I think that's right on. And it's the medieval epoch is the right place to do that, because at the exact same time in different places in the world, medieval ideas are expressing themselves in very different ways, and it's partly a function of space. What is different between China and Europe? What is different between the places in Africa that developed medieval cultures, which were some of the richest cultures in the world, frankly, at that time. I mean, Europe was a backwater during the medieval epoch. So there's a lot to be gained here. Also, I couldn't help noticing there's sort of a relationship here between space and gnosis, right? Because gnosis immerses you in the here and now.
You got it. This is also why why are those fundamental realities? Because those are at least as best we can get as people, those are the closest thing we can get to physical law. You have relationships with time and you have relationships with space. And it's like this: particles move through time and waves move through space. So if you're ever going to get in particle wave dynamic, it's this conversation all over again.
Right. So, if we're a hyper-noetic culture as moderns, that's not surprising that would go hand in hand with being obsessed with time and ignoring space. If noesis is the faculty of the mind that gives us the ability to detect patterns over time and to make plans for future times, there's the hyper intellectualism. You would expect it to go with a focusing too much on time. So
the last part that makes sense here is also spaces are really environments, and look how the modern has treated their environment, right? We've destroyed the spaces we live in because we're focused on time.
Yes. We're all thinking we're going to fly through the stars in Star Trek, and we're not thinking about, well, what if we don't? What if we just have to stay here with our with our industrial pollution and garbage dumps? Then what? The answer is no. I must escape the space into the beauties of time. But Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to address that. I want to thank Ari, but Ari, you being Jewish, I want to address this in a way out of the degree of ignorance. I remember, let's say maybe 5 years back, I had a sort of a semi-relationship with, not relationship, a familiarity with what I suppose called Arab Jews, and they had a meeting, not a meeting, but a presentation at San Diego State University, in which addressed certain issues. And I remember there were some European Jews that was there. I don't know whether I should call them Ashkenazi Jews. There was a really, really contested relationship between them. And so we know that Israel has both Arab Jews and European Jews, let's put it that way. I don't quite want to call them Ashkenazi.
I can answer this very quickly. Number
Okay.
one, my wife is an Arab Jew. Her family comes back from Iraq. And
Yeah.
yes, Jews that are of this culture have a variously different culture, and it is seen as a second class or backwater, almost like relationship to modern and medieval,
Yeah.
of what type of personality you are. And Europeans look at this Arab Jewish culture, and they say outwardly, very muchly, that they don't reject it or don't dismiss it. But you see in their sort of latent inner ways, they very much treat it like a second class citizen in terms of policy or values and principles. And it's a very, for since the dawn of Israel becoming a country 72 years ago, that this has been a problem where the European culture just said we are top dog, and the non-European cultures are looked at as backwater, secondary, not as valuable. They don't have as much political clout. It's not unlike,
But
in
but
some
it,
ways, like,
but it
yeah.
seems like they might have mis appropriated that, because it seems to me you could
Oh,
see
of
that
course,
as a
sure,
contrast, but you could also see that as a way to bridge between the Arabs and the Jews to a certain
sure,
degree.
sure. Yeah, there's. I'm not going to deny any of the possible perspectives. I'm just talking about, like, from a fundamental, like, essentialized breaks reduced summary of what's going on here. It's that the European Ashkenazi culture has dominated Jewish values to believe almost that it is the Jewish culture as opposed
Yeah.
to one among many. It's kind of a problem,
Yeah.
if I'm being honest, is as a source of strife between. It's basic, it's a classic dynamic where one is being dominant, but then sort of feigns this belief that they're actually being dominant when they're being extremely aggressive.
Well, that was the feeling I got. So thank you
Yeah.
for adding to
So
that.
I hope that was clear.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. So what I'm going to do for the remainder of today is take us through the rest of paragraph 10. And the reason I'm going to do it is once we're done with paragraph 10, next week, I want to take us on a supporting side discussion that emphasizes something I realized a few weeks ago and have been kind of putting together on the side to get ready for this discussion, which is that it's not just that people were, in general, were fed up with the corruption of Rome. And it's not just that the medievals criticized the ancient worldview in terms of a new worldview. It's not just either of those things are interesting enough, but it's not just either of those things. It's that the early patristic Christian writers were steeped in ancient philosophy, and they were using judo to critique the ancient world in terms of its own philosophy to show that it was betraying its promise. We've talked before about this idea that epochs end because they make a glorious promise that justifies throwing off the old order and starting into the new epoch, but that ultimately they fall prey to corruption and they betray that promise. Now that sounds like a tidy abstraction, but what we're going to see next week is that that is exactly, precisely the argument that the patristic Christians used to make their argument to spread Christianity within the Roman Empire and eventually replace the ancient epoch. They said specifically, here is the ancient promise, and here is its critique of its own Roman products. And you can see that it has betrayed its own promise, and that's why we have to leave it behind. I've found a way to combine that with the F.M. Cornford Thucydides Mythhistoricus and the Aeschylus and the Aristotle critiques of culture and how they work and arete. So I'll do that next week, but we can only do that if we've got through paragraph 10. So I kind of want to take us through the rest of this paragraph. If y'all are game, get us through the rest of this text. So sentences, we've done sentences 1 and 2, although as I mentioned, we're going to come back to the second half of sentence 2 over and over and over. Here's sentences 3 and 4. Not just the victims of a hyper-materialist world order, but also that order's masters are in truth chained to a logic that has no soulish or spiritual truth, no moral validity at all. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Right? So this is the critique of worldliness that the medievals have being expressed in these terms. And then sentences 5 and 6 here. Against such corruption, Christianity promised redemption. I love this particular part here, which is the buying back of a slave. the liberation from being a commodity in the tides of the market. And when we finish paragraph 10 in just a minute or two, I'm going to call on Ari to talk to us about the Jubilee. But this is the setup for that. This idea.
You're hilarious, Rick. I know. How did you know I know a lot about this too?
I just knew. So it's highly relevant here, right? And this is another way in which Christianity, even though early Christianity is trying to distinguish itself from Judaism and say, well, the Jews are bad and the Christians are good, so you can roam, you can oppress those guys and tear down their temple, but don't oppress us. Instead, adopt us as your religion. On the one hand, it makes it seem like there's this enormous divide between Christianity and Judaism because the Christians are cultivating it. But on the other hand, core to the Christian value system, a lot of this comes straight out of Judaism, including this idea that the way that the medievals are going to cure the ills of ancient Rome is to end slave societies forever by redeeming every last slave until no one is a slave anymore. And the justification for doing that goes all the way back to Judaism. But we'll come to that in a second. So how utterly unworthy is such slavery of a Christian soul that conceives of its high and noble human estate as the only creature made in the image of God, the only place in all of creation where the Creator in effect signed his authorial signature by fashioning a being that could not conceivably have been a product of blind nature. So this is alluding to things we're going to be talking about for the next 2 years, about this idea that although if you infinitize your God the way the medieval Christians did and say he is all good, all powerful, in all places, all knowing, you create all kinds of theological problems for yourself by doing that. And part of the way that they solve that problem is that they say, but despite the fact that he's all wise and we're all foolish, he has given us enough faculties to find our way to him, no matter what. This is core to the medieval theology, because otherwise he couldn't be all good. He would have been creating a situation in which people are doomed to hell. And it was important to the medieval Christians that the medieval Christian God never do that. So every single person who's created has a way to find their way back to God. And partially it's through the gifts and faculties he gives them, but partially it's through the gift of grace. Grace is a critical medieval Christian concept that we're going to talk about over and over and over. It's a tether to God, if you will. It's a reflection of God's goodness that's within our soul. And that what he's saying here is that, if we have this divine spark in us, then it's not worthy of us to be treated like slaves. That's squandering the gift. It's a kind of blasphemy to treat a human being like a utensil, because utensils don't have the spark of God in them, but human beings do. And just like you would never think that it was just to treat God, like toilet paper, you shouldn't treat a human being like toilet paper either. People don't deserve to be slaves. And so this is a rejection of the ancient class caste-based, political economy in a pretty profound way by saying it goes against everything that's sacred. And in doing so, it's also threatening all of the powerful interests of the ancient world, which are founded upon owning lots and lots of slaves who do all the work for you. This is like when Nixon went after the gold standard. It's the kind of thing that will enrage people for ages to come. How dare you attack that thing? That's the thing that we don't want. That's our Achilles heel. Don't you dare attack that thing. So the right to own slaves is sacred to the ancient world. And they're saying, no, not only is it not sacred, not a single human being anywhere on the planet should be a slave. It's a radical inversion of values. And he culminates this paragraph. Did I not get all the way through? Did I not get all the way through? I did not get all the way through the paragraph. I only got partway through it. Look at that. From what did ancient man need to be saved or delivered? From the asphyxiating webs of imperial authority and the ever more radical injustice of concentrated wealth. And I particularly want you to hang on to that theme for next week. The ever more radical injustice of concentrated wealth. From the sordid degradations of a world system expert at ruining the integrity of the soul and bleeding off its morale. And then the final sentences of this paragraph, which are the last three. So this will be, I didn't type this up before we began. So paragraph 10, sentences 9 through 11. Here we go. Oh, nope, I just pasted the same thing again. Give me a second. Let's try that again. It should be this. There. Salvation is not just a matter of repenting over one's personal sinfulness and weakness. Although such self-slavery is a primary obstacle to spirituality. In modernity, what is called Christianity has utterly turned its eyes away from the social, political, and economic mechanisms that enforce wholesale regimes of sinfulness. Organized religion, by this sin of omission, puts itself truly in league with that exploitative world order. It focuses consciences on petty personal retail sins, while organized sin and injustice degrade human lives and souls en masse. These last three sentences are a deviation from the core of this paragraph. And Kenneth does this a lot in his writing and in his talking. So I don't think I've mentioned this before. I'm using this as an opportunity to give you a heads up. Kenneth loves to critique modernity. He's got a strong impulse to go after modernity. And he has that impulse because moderns don't like to be criticized. And we don't like our institutions to be criticized. We don't like our ideologies to be criticized, but we need a lot of it. And he has one of his parables. I can't remember if it's in Otherwise or if it's in Webb's, where he says, you know, modernities can't stand to be criticized at all, but in truth, they need a whole lot of it. It would be healthier for them to seek it out. And instead they run away from it and repel it. So he has a reflex, a knee-jerk reflex to turn away from the topic at hand and go after moderns. And he does that right here, in which he's basically saying the forms of Christianity we see today are not medieval Christianity. These are a different religion going by the same name. And that one of the key ways that you can see the difference is the rising medieval religion under the late Roman Empire went for the throat. It went directly at the institutions of the ancient world. It said that these institutions have to be abolished for people to be free to pursue God. You are standing between people and God, and you don't have a right to do that. It was a revolution theology, a liberation theology is what it was. But as he points out now, it's got people obsessing over whether they masturbate. Right? What did you do in the privacy of your home? That is not what the focus of medieval Christianity was in the beginning. The focus was on overthrowing the old world order. So it's true as far as it goes, these last three sentences, sentences 9 through 11 of paragraph 10. It's true, but also it's a distraction. And I don't really want to talk about it much right now because we could spend forever talking about it. What I think is the more original and interesting part for purposes of the middle part of this book, talking about the medieval worldview, is to set those sentences aside and go back to what came before, where it's talking about the fact that medieval religion had this critique of political economy that explained why the institution of slavery that had existed for over 1,000 years in Europe needed to be abolished and replaced with a brotherhood of man. That was the new world that they wanted to create, in which we're all brothers and sisters under Christ. And that therefore there wouldn't be any more emperors. There wouldn't be any more nobility. We would all be children of God together. It's a radical idea, but it's core to the medieval conception. And it's why later we're going to see so many people rallying around the banner of Joan of Arc, because she's exemplifying it with her life and the things that she does. And everybody who is raised within that worldview can hear the true ring of the bell of her ideology and worldview. It's the bell that was promised to them, but that's not being rung by the political economy they're suffering under during the 100 Years' War. And so they turn away from the powerful to pursue this powerless person who's taking them back to the core promise. They're doing it at a late stage in the medieval epoch to try to get back to the promise of the beginning of the medieval epoch. So this critique that he's doing in paragraph 10, this gets very close to the core critique that the medievals have of the ancient world and the core promise that they're making about what will happen next if you turn away from the ancient value system and turn to this new one This is what the promise is. And, we can talk about this paragraph today, but next week, what I want to do is show you how this critique, as revolutionary as it is, in many ways is just a restatement of Thucydides and Aeschylus's critique. It's using the ancient value system and philosophy to critique the products of the ancient world as being unworthy. So, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This question about slavery was central with Augustine, and it seems to hint that you wonder if he wasn't being a spiritual hitman for authority. Because this was seen to be the argument that was surrounding Pelagius. Now, Pelagius's point is you might have been born a slave, but you could acquire the skills and the habits to be a free man. You don't have to be a slave. You can rise above that. But Augustine seemed to be pushing the idea, hey, you're born into that class. You're born a slave. That's where God has placed you. But don't worry. In the hereafter, if you've got a bad master, he will be punished. And you, the good slave, will be rewarded.
Right. Right.
So Augustine was arguing for fixedness in the class structure, which appeased the empire.
Yes.
Whereas Pelagius comes along, he visits Rome. Now, Augustine said, well, Pelagius, he was a truly pious man. He couldn't critique Pelagius for his personal habits. He truly believed that people should be true to the faith and shouldn't, slide into corruption and all that sort of stuff and the flesh and all that sort of stuff. But the world didn't like his message. He had a few converts, and then Augustine rose up after being a Manichaean for a long time. And he suddenly changed his ways when they started executing Manichaeans and found all sorts of good reasons to return to the church.
What a coincidence.
And not only that, he came up with some outstanding arguments for returning to the church,
Yes.
which really elevated him in the world.
Yes.
And yeah, Pelagius comes along and he's unworldly, but at the same time, he says to people like, some woman comes along and says, I'm married to this guy, but, sex is worldly. And Pelagius says, oh, no, well, you've given your promise. You've made a promise in marriage. It's your duty, I'm afraid. You've given your word to live a certain sort of life with a man, and you must keep your promise.
Right.
So he was very much a person of duty. And we of course, don't have that many sources. We don't still know that much about him. We only know that there was a conflict. This was one of the conflicts which came along. It didn't quite end with him. The conflict with his ideas continued
Right.
later on until you got to the point. It was still raging at the time the Nestorian conflict showed up. But at this point, you're destined to be a carpenter, or you're destined to be a shipbuilder, and this was something the empire was trying to push itself because it just wasn't paying to be a skilled technician anymore. And they were making it compulsory for you to stay in the job of your father. If your father was delivering technical goods, you had to continue that tradition, even if you weren't making any money, because we need your technical goods, or
Yes.
the empire's going to fall. This was another part of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
Take away the slaves, the empire's going to fall.
Yes.
So Augustine was there being the pious defender of imperial society. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, that really highlights the way in which there is a fundamental dialectic at work in a contradiction, really at the heart of the decision to become a religious empire. If you want to be a Christian empire, the medieval Christianity suggests that, well, the first thing you have to do is dismantle the empire because it's built on slavery and nobody should be a slave. And so you've got the people who are being revolutionary and saying, let's do it all in. Let's all be brothers and sisters under God. And then you've got other people who are going, now hold on, let's not be too hasty here. What would happen to us without the empire? If we couldn't defend ourselves from the barbarians, we'd all just be, slaughtered. So we have to make some sacrifices to be willing to, to hold our empire together and defend ourselves. This is the argument, right? You're getting this tug of war back and forth between is God's plan that we're all free, or is God's plan that we all carry out the roles assigned to us by society? And we're going to see that contradiction right at the heart of medieval theology for the whole 1,000 years that it lasts. It's fascinating. But the thing that I think it's important to take away from on this, and that's why I'm so glad Stephen brought this up, is that we can't characterize the medieval epoch as being either one or the other of those two sides. The medieval epoch is that struggle between those two competing worldviews for what does it mean to be a Christian. And it's why you're constantly seeing major thinkers and writers emerge in the medieval period who are taking one position or the other. And they're both revered by the church, despite the fact that they're incompatible with each other. You can't be both don't disrupt the existing order and stay a slave if you're born a slave, and also let's liberate all the slaves and be children of God together. Those are two incompatible ideas, but you will see writers advocating one position or the other who are both revered by the church because they're stuck with the contradiction. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that for me, Stephen. That's really important here. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not going to sing the hymns about slavery, but it seems to me there is a difference between ancient slavery and modern slavery, because ancient slavery seems to be a little bit more democratic. Anybody could become a slave. Modern slavery seems to be based on racism, which is quite different, So like, if you're a different race, particularly if you're black, or actually dark brown, then you are worthy of being a slave. I think that's not only classism, but it's really racism. So I think there's a distinction. So I don't want to sing any hymns to any slaves, but that's a little bit less odious to me, at least. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Well, on this issue of slavery, of course, we have to talk about the Jubilee. And so this is where I was really hoping Ari could come in and tell us something.
All right. Definitely. So we have to I'll do a classic teacher thing that I do. We have to get a couple of definitions of words if we're going to understand what's going on here. First one is redemption. Redemption is a nice teleology of itself, is that the future redeems the past, meaning that your actions in the past can have one meaning when they're occurring, and then an action in the future will change the meaning of the past. It changes the story entirely, and no longer the identity of whatever you had in the beginning of the story without this redeeming point. It's completely transformed. The old thing is completely gone. It doesn't even exist anymore. It's just completely subsumed, and semantically, it's completely different. So the future redeems the past. How do we do that? We do that with a relationship in time, not space. And this is the nature of the Sabbath. First, we are all redeemed and we get the source of our blessing according on the Sabbath every day. This is a reminder of creation, and it's a separation between being holy on this one day and not on the others. And it's to some degree, it's this democratized form of relationship with time where everyone, even a slave or any person of wealth or not, we all do the same thing on the Sabbath. And it's our way of being redeemed each week. And it changes the meaning of the past of, are you living to eat or are you eating to live? Right? And it's this idea of when we work throughout the day and whatnot, we're generally just thinking like we're just focusing on the getting our food, the eating part, so to speak. But on the one day that's separate, where you just sort of, I guess, to be honest, you just take the day off from productive labor, you sort of just live, and you're supposed to spend time with people and hang out. This happens once a week. Okay, that's for people. Next, you go to the land of Israel itself. This happens in the exact same cycle, but once a year, once every 7 years. It's called the sabbatical year. And on this year of measured similarly like on Sunday or Saturday, it happens every week. You just measure 7 years. Like if it's 0 BC, that means 7 BC is going to be a sabbatical year. And then 14 BC is going to be a sabbatical year, and goes on and cycles this. And it's this weird, really weird in terms of how the country can exist. Is the land is supposed to be, you're not allowed to work the land at all agriculturally for a whole year for nothing. You can't do anything. And at the same time, you don't have to let all the plants die. You can like water them and stuff. But the point is, you're not allowed to harvest them and do anything. And you're supposed to like live without an income for a whole year. And it supposedly redeems the land. And then the next period of this cycle, which also there's another mechanism that follows the same cycle of 49 days, 7 weeks of was the 7 weeks of the 7 days within the 7 weeks nested, which is 50 days, actually the 50th day. After 7 weeks, you have the time that the Jewish people supposedly got out of Egypt to when they received the revelation at Mount Sinai. It's supposed to be 7 weeks, and it's a period. It represents, at least mythologically, the number represents a period of complete transformation or restoration, something to bringing back to an original point in the thing. And so this is how where you have this period of 7 is like a redeeming re-beginning, like starting the game over. That happens for the land every 7 years, for our week every week. That's apparently where 7-day weeks come from. And then this idea of people or property itself, all property goes back to its original owner on the 50th year, which means all debts are canceled, all any loans, it's all gone. And let's say, and the way it really works is if your family was originally the owner of a plot of land because you were of the tribe of Levi, or actually Levium can't hold the property. If you're the tribe of whoever, Zebulon, right, and your family has an ancient birthright to a property, every 50 years that property resorts back to its original owner. And the idea is the people don't own the land, God owns the land, and he redeems it every 50 years. And so this works for all property. And so all slaves are considered property. All slaves are made free on the 50th year, and it redeems the slave, and essentially it changes the story of the past and gives a new meaning to the future. So I think that was a good. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I think that covers pretty much everything.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Ari. You torture that like crazy, but you hit all the major points, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. So that shows the architecture in time of these concepts of redemption and Sabbath and Jubilee. And this is the stuff that Kenneth is referring to when he talks about, what are people being saved from? What is the redemption that Christianity is promising? It's this redemption. It's that the great sin from a Jewish theological perspective of the Roman Empire, of the many sins, the great sin is that there is never a Jubilee. There's never a redemption. It's trying to be an eternal condition in which people are owned and never liberated again. They never go back. There's never an acknowledgement that there's something larger than the emperor, more important than the emperor. And it goes hand in hand with the Jewish abhorrence of the concept that the Caesar is a god and you have to worship him, which the Jews absolutely refused to do, which got them in enormous amounts of trouble with the Roman Empire. Is this idea that something should be higher than human beings, and that the Jews were going to stick with that. They would compromise on certain things, but that was one of the things they were not going to compromise on, and that the sacred is whole. It's a unitary thing. This is this is why the war was so bitter, that led to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Phil, you got your hand up. What's up?
Yeah, I have a question about that, because when you mention redemption, two things pop up into me, and it seems like you might have had introduced a third thing, but redemption, uh, in a religious sense, means that you are redeemed from whatever your sins are, in some sense, right? So, in that sense, but the other one is more like economic structure, in terms of debt. The redemption is it's a relationship between the future debt, I guess, and the repayment. So I wonder which came first. What was it a kind of, I don't mean the redeeming of the property and the land and the crops and all that. Seems like that's kind of based on a kind of agricultural, uh, but a marketing structure to a certain degree, like goods and so forth. Which came first? Was it the religion that produced that, or was it that created a concept for the religion to have that? So, in some sense, what's the relationship between the religious redemption and the monetary redemption, in terms of like goods and products? Could you say something about that? Because it seems like a very interesting relationship or paradox.
So not every question gets to have a solid answer. And what I can tell you about your question is great, but the problem with it is that everyone has an ideologically motivated answer based on whatever their theology is. But when it comes to what actually happened in history, anthropologically, which came first, it's very difficult to find evidence that would tell us. I mean, what would that if you were digging in the ruins, of some village, in Israel, what evidence could you possibly look for that could prove one way or the other which one came first?
Well, for instance, I think I was struck by the crop. Every 7 years the land will remain fallow. I hope it wasn't the entire country because you would be in bad shape. But it seems to me redemption in that sense is for the plants to recuperate, or for the land to recuperate,
Yeah,
for production. So that seems like it's based on an economic thing in relationship to nature and the
it could be
production.
very old. It could be very old.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the discovery of the need to let land lie fallow and regenerate itself
Yeah.
goes way back into the Neolithic.
It seems like a really important thing. I don't know in modern agriculture, whether we actually do that, to what degree we do that, or do we just put more fertilizer on and that's the redemption? I don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting, at least an ancient idea that's important for recuperation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so we can see that the agricultural practice goes back many, many thousands of years. I mean, far before written history, people are doing this. But what we don't know, the part that we can't demonstrate, is that we have only the most tenuous understanding of what the religion was like back then. I mean, and it's constantly being overthrown in revolutionary ways, like through the discovery of Göbekli Tepe. Which before we discovered Göbekli Tepe, we had these orthodoxies about the order in which civilization developed, and Göbekli Tepe threw that all out the window. It's like, well, now that we've discovered this place that apparently preceded agriculture, and yet people were living in a settled form. What the hell? That's not supposed to happen according to our rules of history. So it's making us think that people might have formed cities for religious reasons first, and then developed agriculture in order to support their religion. Because they were exhausting the hunt and gatherer possibilities around that space. So that means what that means to me is that whenever we've got an established orthodoxy that tells us the order in which things have to have happened, and we're doing that in advance of the evidence, we got to be cautious, because I mean, any piece of evidence could come along at any moment to make us throw out our entire conception. And I don't know what the evidence would have to look like to tell us that the religion came first. It could have come first, but what would prove it? I don't know. I mean, this is before writing, so they're not going to tell us in their own words. It's a great question, though. I mean, like you, I really wish I knew the relationship better. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so we've got in this paragraph, we've got there was the ancient heretical doctrine that was brought up in the Dark Ages of the two souls. So here, well, when we refer to man, the Western Church decided henceforth we will only talk about body and soul and not spirit. And they called the doctrine that one had a soul and a spirit. Well, you're really just saying we have two souls. Doesn't sound too good, doesn't it? Sounds a bit confusing. But here in this paragraph somewhere, I was trying to pick it out again, he talks about soulishness and the spirit in the same line. And you did say that Kenneth Smith had a lot to say about what is the soul and what is the spirit. So, you know, maybe keep in mind you can give us a great revelation on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. This is one of the things, Kenneth's got a lot of stuff he writes about that at any given time is ahead of my understanding. And it can take me years, sometimes decades, before my philosophy develops enough that I start to recognize what he's talking about. Soul versus spirit is something that I've recognized for a while is something that he had worked out in some detail long before I did. I didn't have clear conceptions of either of those things when I was first reading Kenneth. And reading Kenneth, and more importantly, reading the writers he points at, has helped me to fill that in. So I know that when it comes to soul and spirit, we're gonna be talking about, yeah, that's the line, right? No soulish or spiritual truth, no moral validity at all. He's going to be in the medieval epoch as we go forward. He's going to be quoting Aquinas and Augustine and others, and their conceptions of what is the soul under the medieval worldview and what is the spirit of the medieval worldview. And what we're going to see when we get into that stuff is that it too contrasts dramatically with the ancient conceptions of soul and spirit. So I think one issue here is the idea that the soul and the spirit are both important in classical ancient worldview, but by the time you get to the late Roman worldview, they're de-emphasizing spirit and more emphasizing soul because they want you to think about staying put. They want an established order that doesn't change. They want you to stay a slave or whatever your role is. And the last thing in the world they want is your soul to go in motion and transform the world. So there's a de-emphasis on spirit, and that coincides with the rise of the new medieval Christianity, which is emphasizing spirit. I mean, the Holy Spirit is one of the parts of the Trinity, one of the aspects of the Trinity, one of the voices of the Trinity. And so soul and spirit is rejuvenated as a concept under medieval Christianity. But as for the details, that's going to have to wait for the chapters ahead. It's going to be, he's going to go into it in some detail, but it's
we've got Jung and Nietzsche in this question as well. Jung
yes,
seems to separate between one as an individual being, as a soul.
Yes.
And for him, the spirit was the archetypes.
Yes.
And Nietzsche seemed to be saying something similar that, well, if you're simply a body and a soul, you're just part of the herd.
Uh-huh.
To rise above the herd, you're going to have to tackle the spirit.
Cultivate your spirit. Yeah. Yeah. And I think Kierkegaard is another major source of the philosophical concept of the spirit for Kenneth. And that's a problem for me in this presentation as of today, because of the major philosophers who are influences on Kenneth's philosophy, Kierkegaard is the one I've read the least of. I may quote him a lot, but I keep quoting the same parts of Kierkegaard because I've only read a little bit of him. And I'm going to have to change that during the next 2 years as we go through this, because Kierkegaard, of the Hegelians and young Hegelians and post-Hegelians, Kierkegaard perhaps has the most to say about the spirit of any of them, although he does it in his odd role-playing dialogue, sometimes sarcastic way. But he cares passionately about these topics. So I'm going to have to spend more time with Kierkegaard before I'm going to be able to do justice to this.
Well, doesn't Hegel spend a lot of time with spirit? Because it seems like spirit is the active agent
Yes.
that ascends the ladder to the soul, or maybe it goes descend, I mean, depending on where the soul is located. The soul seems somewhat fixed, and then you have to kind of actively pursue it in some sense to unfold it in some sense, if you believe in that religious relationship. Because but because without the spirit, you're stuck where you are. You're not gonna move toward whatever is inevitable. I think the spirit's very important. It's an active agent.
Yes.
And it seems to me that spirit is in the world. I mean, it's in the world. It's
Hey,
just,
you there, stop that heresy. This is coming
oh.
from above. The spirit, the church will work out the spirit for you, man. Just concentrate on your soul and your body. All telephone lines to God pass through the church.
Yes. Yes. I'd like us to make each other a promise for the next 2 years as we go through the medieval section. At some point during each seminar, someone needs to accuse somebody else of being either a heretic or a blasphemer. Because it's the recurring concern, right, of this theology is who's deviating from the norm. And the problem is
Okay, I'll be the heretic, or I have to go to confession and let my spirit be delivered to the Holy Church that will have the hotline to move in action.
Well, I think that this is a hoist on one's own petard situation because the core theology is changing over the course of 1,000 years. Even people who were not heretics or blasphemers at one period would be considered so by a later period. So sooner or later, we're all heretics and blasphemers according to this. And really, we just need to help each other see where we have strayed from the one truth. It'll be helpful. So thank you, Stephen. You kicked off the initiating shot, and we will keep doing that every week. I hope you all had a great time. I had a lovely time. This is some good stuff we're getting into. And next week,
Highlight of my week, absolutely highlight of my week. Heretics abound.
heretics abound.
Hey, Stephen, I resent you kicking me down the road.
Well, there's two things. There's heresy means opinion,
Yes.
and there's dogma. Dogma means opinion. So there's the correct opinion, and
That's
there's
right.
the incorrect opinion. The incorrect opinion is the one that'll get you into trouble.
That's right. So we'll see you all next week when we take a deep dive into the sins of excessive wealth and excessive poverty, which is the medieval critique against the ancient Roman Empire. So have a great week, everyone. Bye, Donna.
Bye.